He eluded detection for over a decade. With no clear victim profile, no clear connection to his victims, seemingly random killings spanning the entire country, and is regarded as one of the most methodical and elusive serial killers of the 21st century. A man who defied every FBI profile and left no trace when the deed was done. Yet, all the while, he was just a normal guy that no one suspected. This is the story of serial killer Israel Keyes. Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder, all things that I love to consume, and I know you do too, you sick, twisted, beautiful, intellectually minded. Today, we are diving into a very infamous serial killer. I feel like a lot of people don't know a lot about, though. He is up there with my top POSs, so trigger warning there. So without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go mock fight down the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through this windshield into this infamous serial killer together. You know, I spend a lot of time diving into the darkest corners of human behavior on this channel, but when I come home, my pets remind me that pure, unconditional love actually exists. And they're a very important and part of my life, and they very much help me decompress from all the darkness. And my pets deserve the world, which means they deserve the best food they can get. And that is Ollie. And for those of you who don't know, Ollie offers fresh, protein-packed meals made with real human-grade ingredients, which is an absolute win for all my dogs' health. And they also offer 5 tasty recipes, which are all slow-cooked for top nutrition, which is also a win for my dog's happiness. And these are vet nutritionist-backed recipes crafted with actual culinary experts. And the meals come perfectly portioned in mess-free packaging with a scoop and storage container, so no weird fridge smells. And plus, there's an app that lets you tap real experts for on-demand health screenings. And since switching over, my dog's coat is shinier and mealtime has become their favorite time of the day. Well, it already was before, but now they're extra excited, like their tails wag way more because they know they're getting the best meal they could ever have. And before, they used to like take a little bit of a nibble and then they kind of walk away and do stuff, but now they're just eating the meal. That's what they're completely focused on, so I can tell that they enjoy Ollie's food a lot. But your dog's well-being starts with their food, and that's why Ollie delivers fresh, human-grade food that your dog will love. So head to ollie.com/CCCM and tell them all about your dog, and use code CCCM to get 60% off your welcome kit when you subscribe today. And plus, they offer a happiness guarantee on the first box, so if you're not completely satisfied, you'll get your money back. So that's OLLIE.com/CCCM and enter code CCCM to get 60% off your first box. Thank you so much to Ollie for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel, and let's get back to it. Israel Keyes was reportedly born in Richmond, Utah on January 7th, 1978. And he was the second born to Heidi and John, or Jeff, Keyes. And his 9 other siblings included America, Autumn Rose, Charity, Hosanna, and Sunshine. Sounds like names of kids people are coming up with nowadays. I tell you what, it's just like they see something in the room and they're like, we're gonna name him Dr. Pepper. But anyway, they are getting insane and it needs to be addressed. But I digress. So Jeff, Israel's father, was once a Mormon missionary, but had largely lost faith in mainstream religion and society as a whole by the time he became a father. And Heidi and Jeff decided to raise their family in the wilderness, as they despised government interference, on top of modern medicine and public schools. So they were quite literally off the grid. So being off the grid, each of the children were delivered at their home, and self-sufficiency was a virtue. So when Keyes was around 5 years old, the family packed up and moved to an isolated plot of land in the forests of Colville, Washington. And Jeff supposedly built their cabin by hand. And initially, continuing Jeff's tradition, the family were members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Utah, or the LDS Church. But shortly after the move to Washington, they left the LDS or Mormon faith in favor of the Christian identity movement, which is not to be confused with just Christians in general. This Christian identity movement had racist white supremacist beliefs. And Heidi and Jeff became devout followers and joined a local church called the Ark, where it was preached that white people are God's true chosen people. Okay. All right. And the church also held many anti-Semitic and anti-government views. And as you can imagine, life in the congregation was rather strict and extremist, and the children attended services that taught racial hatred. Just crazy to believe just teaching little kids how to be racist. It just doesn't click in my mind, but it's not my life. I'm reading about someone else's. So the Keyes family lifestyle did away with modern amenities and culture in an effort to uphold their religious beliefs, not unlike that of the Amish. Not saying Amish are racist bigots, by the way. They just like to live off the grid like the Amish people, and that's it. That's the only similarity there. Just want to make that very clear. Amish people, pretty awesome. So they remained cut off from society as a whole. And Keyes' childhood home in Colville was a one-room cabin that lacked running water, plumbing, and electricity. And it was so small, in fact, that many of the children had to sleep outside of the cabin in tents, regardless of weather conditions. And the Keyes kids learned that family virtue of self-sufficiency at a very young age. And they hunted wild animals for food, chopped firewood, and worked on neighboring farms for money, and to help the family out in their extreme poverty. And their everyday life was geared towards survival and necessity rather than play and proper schooling. And homeschooling was the closest thing to a formal education that they got. And while homeschooling can be very effective, my husband was homeschooled and he is a literal savant genius, that's usually only the case if the education is actually done right. Because it seems that in this particular situation, it was more about restriction than true learning. So it's like they learned the bare minimum and they were completely sheltered from the rest of the world. So it's almost like they were born and raised in a different time period. So when they got out in the real world, it was not the same thing. Bit of a shock, you could say. So as Keyes grew up, he found himself in a bubble of religious extremism through the ever-watchful eyes of his parents, and deeply influenced by the family's involvement with the Christian identity churches. But the Keyes family eventually left the Ark to join the Christian Israel Covenant Church, which Israel later described as militia-like. Sounds like a treat. And they blended more racist theology with a focus on armed training and readiness. And Israel would become proficient with guns at a very early age and learn to stockpile food and weapons. So it's a big, it's cult. It's a cult. Essentially, it's fear mongering. It's end of the world is coming. It's this one guy knows everything and only he's the guy, only God can talk to me because I know everything. And it's definitely not to get all your money and to go buy a private jet and fly off to frickin' Hawaii or something. So religious passion, racism, and a growing love of guns actively surrounded Israel. And it was also through this church and their close proximity as neighbors that the Kehoe family would become friends of the Keyes family. And the Kehoes were a physical representation of these militant ideals. Now, Shavi Kehoe, who was 5 years older than Israel, would later be arrested with his brother Cheney in 1997 after a somewhat famous incident involving a police shootout. And he was also convicted of multiple murders in which he killed a gun dealer and the dealer's wife and daughter, and was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences. And Keyes' close proximity to such violent individuals and ideology certainly had an effect on him. So turns out growing up in a racist militia doomsday cult isn't all that good for kids. So even in his early childhood, Israel had already begun to demonstrate concerning behaviors, because he was obsessed with guns. And by his own admission, he hunted anything with a heartbeat as a boy, killing animals of all shapes and sizes just for the thrill, not for necessity to eat, just because he liked it. Red flag number 1. And red flag number 2 is that he was no stranger to animal torture as well, because Keyes was once seen tying a cat to a tree and shooting it to death, to the horrors of those who watched. And animal cruelty is, of course, a potentially early indicator of psychopathy. And red flag number 3 was petty crimes were all too common for Israel when he was younger. And he was actually known to break into his neighbors' houses just to rob them, stealing guns and various other items. And he allegedly stockpiled these stolen weapons in a cache at his house. And when this was discovered, he was forced to return the weapons and apologize. And Keyes would also vandalize by shooting at neighbors' houses with a BB gun and setting fires in the woods. Ooh, youth arsonist, red flag number, I'm just gonna say 40 at this point. So those that had the opportunity to cross paths with this little piece of shit psychopath during his early to mid-teens noted a kind of creepiness to him. And one girl who knew him said that being around him, quote unquote, made her skin crawl. And certainly reaching over 6 feet tall in height at the age of 14 made him fairly physically imposing, which intimidated other kids. And he once bragged about skinning a deer while it was still alive. What? After which point, most of the kids from the congregation and the few neighbors he had didn't want much to do with him. Kind of crazy that, these racist, militant, doomsday weirdos are creeped out by the kid that, obviously, all the things he's doing is crazy, but even they're like, whoa, dude, that's a bit too much, okay? We're cool with being racist militants, but maybe lay off the fire, all right? So Keyes was aware of his deviance early on, and he had said that by the time he was 14, and he recognized his thoughts and behaviors weren't seen as normal by other people. So he's aware of what he's doing, and especially the incident noted before where he tortured and shot the cat, noting that people's reaction to it pushed him to spend more time to himself and mask his behaviors in the presence of others. Classic psychopath, essentially. And he said, quote, "I've known since I was 14 that there were things that I thought were normal and okay that no one else seemed to think were normal and okay. So that's when I just started being a loner. And people found out about some of the stuff I did, like my parents and parents of other kids who would hang out with me. They would find out about some of the stuff I did, and that's when I just started doing stuff by myself, exclusively," unquote. So as he continued to grow, so did his dark side, and he began to cultivate what was essentially a double life. One that would be the public-facing persona that would fit in and please his parents and those around him, and the other that would allow his darkest desires to be free and satisfied. And he tried to rationalize his violent thoughts and tendencies through his religious upbringing, attempting to place the blame on Satan or other evil powers, not taking any sort of responsibility for his actions. But ultimately, he came to terms with the belief that violence was simply part of who he was, and Keyes' strict and unforgiving home situation left him with no healthy outlet or anything to help prevent his troublesome psychopathic behaviors. And supposedly, there's a possibility that he was abused by his father as well, though this is unconfirmed. But if true, it would certainly have added all the more reason for anger and lack of empathy. So Keyes' circumstance and influences essentially molded him into a predator in training by his teen years, and he would keep his deeper fantasies secret, knowing they were socially unacceptable. And the secrecy and depth were just the beginning of what would later manifest itself into his adult life. And it's crazy to think how if he grew up around, some sort of where therapy was okay, or in a loving family, it's the nature-nurture argument. It's like, I feel like maybe a little bit of this was already in him, but the environment in which he was raised just nurtured that character, and he essentially just learned how to hide it. And obviously, I have a bias now because I know what an evil human being he became. But as a kid, I always have empathy for the kid because it's like, I feel like environment is always some sort of factor. So Keyes' family packed up and moved a couple times during his teens. And the precise timings and movement of Keyes and his family are somewhat difficult to determine from various sources, but some claim that Keyes was with his family as they moved, and others claim he went independently, and potentially not at all, so it's kind of up in the air. But regardless of timing and whether he was with them, the locations they moved to are confirmed. So in the mid to late 1990s, the Keyes family moved to Maupin, Oregon. Sorry if I'm saying that wrong. Which is a small desert town located directly along the Deschutes River. And it was in this town that Keyes claims he committed his first violent crime, which we'll discuss shortly. And later, the Keyes family moved near an Amish community in Smyrna, Maine. Sorry if I'm saying that wrong. Where they became involved in a local maple syrup business. And eventually, one of the Keyes sisters wrote that the move to Maine was part of their father's attempt to fix the older children's behavior by removing bad influences. So the parents are thankfully seeing how their children are acting and trying to change it, I guess. I mean, there's, the whole religious thing behind it and being racist and all that, but, couldn't be that. Couldn't be that. But they thought, supposedly, it wouldn't be present near the Amish community. Bad behavior, that is. But by the time the family had relocated to Maine, the Keyes had become fully disconnected from them. Yet there is evidence that he was present in the area, as at least one source mentions that there was a neighbor that called Keyes a nice, courteous young man. So this disconnect from the family arose from Keyes' departure from their tradition. And throughout his teenage years, Keyes struggled with the faith of his family. And he eventually realized that he did not share the beliefs that his parents did. And that was hard for him, considering he had worked hard to please them for so long. And whether that desire to please was legitimate or simply masking is very hard to say. But he clearly wanted some sort of validation from his parents. But by his later teens, he rebelled against them and openly renounced his faith in Christian identity. And Keyes became interested in Satanism during this period. And this led to a serious confrontation between him and his parents. And the response to his blasphemy was to exile him from their home and forbid any of his siblings from having contact with him ever again. Yet even with the loss of his family in this way, Keyes earned a sort of freedom here. And he was no longer bound by any rules, but the ones he made for himself. So he finally found some sort of independence. And he later admitted that he became an atheist. And by rejecting any sort of external morality, the stage was set for his future violent acts to come. And he reportedly had fully embraced his desire to kill by this point in his life, so his late teens, noting that it was just a matter of time before he acted on his impulses. So Keyes' first known violent crime was an SA that went unreported, and he was living in Maupin, Oregon at the time, sometime between 1996 to 1998, and decided to live out his fantasy of abducting and murdering a person. Extremely f***ed up, and his target was a young girl, estimated to be between the ages of 14 to 18, who was having a day out with friends on the Deschutes River. And according to his confession later on, Keyes watched the girl from the tree line until she was separated from her group. And he then waded out to her, grabbed her tube, and pulled her to the shore at knife point. And then he would drag her to a remote area, allegedly a campground restroom, and he would tie her up, and then he proceeded to her. And Keyes had every intention to murder this girl as part of a satanic ritual he had been fantasizing about, and he told investigators that he brought knives that he planned to use for her gruesome killing and disposal. But the girl's cries for help and attempts to humanize herself in the presence of her potential killer actually made Keyes hesitate. But thank God. What a strong woman. Like, always cry out for help. It's just, I'm so glad that she did that. And she would promise that she would never tell anyone if he just let her go. And surprisingly, her calm demeanor saved her life. And in his own words, quote, "She was pretty smart. It worked," unquote. And he released the girl and sent her back on her way to meet back up with her friends. Quote, "I was too timid. I wasn't violent enough," unquote, Keyes would later admit. And he would go on to say that he would not let that happen again. And he vowed never to let another victim escape alive. So the incident remained unreported and was most likely unknown altogether until Keyes' eventual confession. So when Keyes was 20 years old, he decided to join the Army, and he earned his GED and traveled to Albany, New York in 1998 and enlisted on July 9th. And records show that he served as a specialist while in uniform, and Keys went through basic and then advanced infantry training, both of which he actually excelled at. Which isn't all that surprising, given he was in a militia when he was 9 years old. And he even completed the U.S. Army Rangers course, which is an elite training program focused on small unit tactics, endurance, and leadership. So he was an extremely capable soldier, fit, disciplined, and possessing great knowledge of weapons. All also the horrifying makes of a devastating serial killer. So Keys was posted in multiple locations during his Army service from 1998 to 2001, and he first served at Fort Lewis in Washington as part of the 1st Battalion, 5th Infantry Regiment, 25th Infantry Division on the mortar team. That was a mouthful. And later he was stationed at Fort Hood in Texas, followed by a 6-month deployment overseas to the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. And the deployment was relatively uneventful, at least from what we know, though Keys was able to make friends and travel the region, reportedly patronizing ladies of the night during his time on leave, though. And his peers noted that he seemed to do really well with the regimented lifestyle that the Army provided, showing no obvious signs of the darkness that would later be revealed, at least not while they were on duty. So outside of his excellent performance, Keys' demeanor as a soldier was generally quiet and withdrawn, and he tended to keep to himself on base and didn't really cause any trouble. That is, until the weekend came around. And he was known to be a heavy drinker when he was off duty, and he allegedly would finish entire bottles of Wild Turkey, which is his favorite bourbon. And there were some subtle signs that Keys possessed the capacity for violence that showed themselves in the Army and were most likely just overlooked at the time. And at one point, while deployed in Egypt, he allegedly told another soldier that he would, quote-unquote, would like to kill him. Red flag number 152. And while in custody years later, he confessed to allegedly attempting to a lady of the night and a college student he met while deployed. And he also really loved insane clown pose and had large posters of the group posted in the barracks. And though not necessarily an indicator of violence, the group's music does have violent references, and some sparked some controversial discussion over whether or not it incites actual violence. Which I don't know if that's the case. I feel like people who are violent will gravitate towards violent music, and it'll just, it's just something they like because they're already like that. I don't think music really makes you that way. But what do I know? I don't know. But his only major run-in with the law was when he was arrested for DUI in February of 2001, and his record was clean other than that. And one of his Army friends later noted that Keys' dark side would show when he drank. But of course, at the time, none of these things were connected to any criminal activity. At worst, his antics were most likely viewed as simply blowing off some steam. So Keys' service would come to an end when he was honorably discharged from the Army on July 8th, 2001 at Fort Lewis. And on paper, his military career was exemplary, and he received several awards, including Army Achievement Medal recognizing his service as a gunner or assistant gunner, an Army Service Ribbon, a Marksman Badge with Rifle Bar, an Expert Infantryman Badge, an Air Assault Badge. So now that the chapter with the Army had finished, Keys returned to civilian life. But his military experience had provided him with skills with handling weapons even better than he did when he was 9 years old, and utilizing stealth and extreme endurance, all of which came in handy for realizing his very dark desires. So Keys made his way back to Washington State, starting his next chapter of life on the Makah Indian Reservation in Nia Bay. And he lived with Tammy Hawkins, a woman that he had met and begun dating while stationed at Fort Lewis. And Tammy was a member of the tribe, and by the time Keys discharged, she was pregnant with his child. And Tammy gave birth to Lainey in late 2001, and Keys led what was, by all appearances, a very stable life as a loving father and supportive partner for the next 6 years, which is just crazy to imagine. I mean, I just think of, John Wayne Gacy and BTK and Ed Camper, all these people that are like capable of living double lives. It blows my mind, but Israel was absolutely one of them. So Israel worked for the Makah Tribal Council and was known as a reliable handyman. And he seemed to welcome domestic life, as neighbors recall him as polite and a quiet man who was kind and helpful. Yet, unknown to those around him, his darker side was ever present and growing much stronger amidst the mask of a normal life. So no longer bound to the structured life of the army and living far from anyone who really knew him, Keyes found the freedom he needed to finally begin his killing fantasies. And he later admitted that he started killing people in 2001, shortly after moving to Neah Bay. And he claimed that between 2001 and 2006, that he murdered at least 4 people in Washington state, all of which were crimes that were never connected or figured out. And Keyes also implied that he killed someone in 2001 around Neah Bay and either buried or submerged the body in a remote location. But the body was never found in a related search, but was ruled an accidental death. And one of the murders was a double homicide, and Keyes alleged that he abducted and killed a young couple somewhere between 2001 and 2005. And he said that he beat the male victim to death with a shovel and strangled the female victim, then buried both bodies in an undisclosed location. And these identities are still unknown, and no matching missing persons case has been linked. And the other murders were of 2 individuals in separate incidences around 2005 and 2006. And one of the victims' bodies was disposed of in Lake Crescent, but this body was never recovered either. And Keyes did not give the names of these victims, and none of them have been identified nor connected to Keyes in any meaningful way. So these initial murders went under the radar of authorities because Keyes was very careful about his victims' selection, and he chose random victims and left minimal, if any, evidence. All the while, he continued living his life, giving no indication to anyone around him that he was now a murderer. And investigators do believe that his first murder likely occurred in that first summer Keyes was in Neah Bay, and the FBI continues to look into open cases in Washington and the surrounding areas from this time frame, just attempting to use Keyes' travel history as a guide. And when asked why he committed the murders in Neah Bay, he replied, quote, "Neah Bay's a boring town," unquote. What a f***ing monster. But these are all murders that potentially happened, but were never actually verified. So as Keyes began realizing his desires, he spent a ton of time studying other serial killers and understanding how to avoid their mistakes. And he pored over case studies and FBI publications, and he read books and articles, and he became intimately familiar with how profilers worked, and he greatly admired other killers who traveled like he did. And one in particular that Keyes was fond of was none other than Ted Bundy, who he considered an influence. And Bundy also masked his true self for years and traveled between states to kill. And Keyes' approach to murder became obsessively calculated and methodical. And one of the biggest realizations of the risks of serial killers was holding on to weapons or souvenirs that could tie them to the crimes they commit. And also committing said crimes near where they lived, adding themselves to the suspect pool by proximity. And to combat this, he began crafting and burying kill kits around the country. And these were caches that he used to hide weapons, ammo, cash, zip ties, chemicals to dissolve bodies, and other tools. He was doing what he did as a little kid when he stole stuff from the neighbor's house and put them in a cache, which is essentially a place where you just store items that are usually hidden. So he was just, by all accounts, like the most premeditated murderer I've ever heard of. He was hiding caches in places where he wasn't even looking for victims at that point yet. He was just knowing that eventually he would, but he was just doing that so he wouldn't get caught. It's just, the methodology of Israel Keyes is absolutely insane. So the cache would be plastic buckets or bins, and he would place them in secret locations so he could dig them up whenever he wanted them for a murder. And inside these buckets were the weapons and chemicals and anything that he would want to murder someone. And thanks to this level of pre-planning, he could simply arrive in an area and already have everything he needed for the kill. No need for suspicious purchases or carrying incriminating items while traveling. And sometimes these caches were buried years before being used. Again, the level of evil, and this obviously being the number one thing he thinks about all the time, is just, it's insane. Like, for example, one that he planted in Essex, Vermont in 2009, he didn't use until 2011 for the Courier murders, which we will talk about shortly. And he hid kits in several states across the US, some of which were discovered after Keyes disclosed their locations, and many of which have yet to be found. So there's still God knows how many caches, Israel Keyes caches out there in the United States. And Keyes stuck to a few rules that helped him avoid detection. He never killed close to home, and he never killed in the same area more than once, unless during the same murder. And he intentionally crossed jurisdictions to take advantage of the informational gaps between law enforcement agencies, especially at the time. Because it's gotten better and better over the years, but even in the 90s and early 2000s, it was still a bit dodgy. So his crimes were so scattered both in location and time that a single killer was never suspected. And in order to fund his future murderous pursuits, Keyes committed a string of bank and home robberies to steal money and various other items to sell. And at least 2 of these bank robberies were confirmed. One in Tupper Lake, New York in April of 2009, and the other one in Azul, Texas in February 2012. And the stolen funds were used to pay for airline tickets, rental cars, gas, and any and all other expenses accrued in the murder of innocent people. But he also had a legitimate construction business, which also provided extra funds that helped his process. So Keyes' relationship with Tammy had begun to fall apart in 2006, and the couple parted ways, though Laney would split time between the two of them. And not long after, he began a new relationship with a woman named Kimberly Anderson around 2007, and she was a nurse practitioner from Alaska, and the relationship progressed fairly quickly, turning serious after a very short time. And when Kimberly decided to move back to Alaska for work, Keyes decided to follow. So Keyes and Laney moved along with Kimberly to Anchorage, Alaska, where they settled into the city's Turn Again neighborhood, which was home to many professionals and a state superior court judge. And Keyes immediately got to work starting up a business, and he founded Keyes Construction to make use of his extensive construction and handyman skills, and advertised himself as a reliable contractor for home projects. And he built decks and fences and remodeled kitchens and more. And clients viewed him as competent and efficient, earning himself a good reputation for his craftsmanship in the community. And he continued to uphold his former image of adoring father and devoted partner once again, even though now that was different with a different partner. But Keyes spoke lovingly about his daughter to coworkers and neighbors. And the family had pet pugs who were well taken care of, and Keyes had even built a special ramp for them so they could easily walk from the back porch down into the yard. So by all accounts, they just appeared like a very normal, nice family, which just makes all of this extra horrifying. And people who interacted with Keyes knew him as friendly, yet just like an unremarkable guy, because he worked really hard to not draw too much attention to himself. And he was generally polite and just soft-spoken. And a local attorney who hired him for his handyman services said, quote, "I never got any bad or weird, scary, odd vibe from him in any way, shape, or form," unquote. He was just seen as dependable and spent lots of time caring for Laney, often taking her on trips. And Keyes also loved the outdoors, which is not uncommon for people in Alaska, because he loved fishing, he loved hiking and kayaking and camping. And his apparent passion for being in the wild and his survival skills helped him fit right into Alaskan culture. And anyone who knew him recognized the importance he placed on his family relationship, which is why so many were at a loss for words when his crimes would eventually come to light. But beneath that nice, normal guy exterior, Keyes continued to indulge in his dark fantasies. And between 2007 and 2012, his time in Anchorage specifically, he executed some of his most carefully planned and far-reaching murders. Extending that time frame to include a few extra years, he traveled extensively from October 2004 to March 2012 with at least 35 multi-state trips, many of which were to hunt for victims. And his strategy for these trips was a well-oiled machine, as he would fly to a given location, rent a car nearby, and then drive hundreds or thousands of miles to his target area. So this just separated his place of entrance from the crime scene and the crime. And he also paid for everything in cash and removed the battery from his cell phone to prevent it from being tracked. And on the road, Keyes carefully made sure he kept a low profile. And it worked, as he was able to travel between multiple states throughout these years completely under the radar of the authorities. And oftentimes, he would combine family visits and vacations with scouting for his next victims and prepping for the deed. And in retrospect, it's unclear if these visits and trips actually served the dual purpose of seeing family and relaxing while scouting, or if the sole purpose was to scout while hiding that intention. And when the FBI finally mapped out the totality of Keyes' travels, they found that unsolved murders and disappearances seemed to align, and Keyes was very patient when looking for his victims, waiting for just the right moment of opportunity. And he preferred places like campgrounds, parks, and cemeteries or boating docks, as they were very remote, quiet places where potential victims could be alone. And he'd stake out these areas sometimes for days, holding out for that perfect person to come along. And Keyes said that he would usually let the victim come to me by selecting spots that people naturally passed through but were usually isolated. And if he was proactive and scouting houses, he chose easily accessible locations with avoidable security and no additional people, like children or watchful neighbors or dogs to alert. An opportunity was the driver here rather than the specific type of victim, because he did not discriminate on that person, just that the time was right with no one to witness. And because of this specifically, he had no consistent victim profile, at least in the traditional sense. And the victims varied in age, gender, and ethnicity. And he later claimed that he had a specific rule against harming children, which allegedly arose from his daughter. And it's true that no confirmed victims were children, but many remain unsure if this was genuine or part of Keyes' just games that he loved to play. And Keyes also made sure to fully cover his tracks, and he disposed of bodies in secluded areas, sometimes sinking them in bodies of water or using chemicals to dissolve them. And as mentioned before, he didn't hold on to keepsakes like the murder weapon or items from the victims, and made sure they were removed and never found. And though Israel effectively hid his criminal life, he still had his demons in his personal life. And he never quite kicked his drinking habit from the army, and that was coupled with severe bouts of seasonal depression, especially being in Alaska where it's dark a lot of the time. And this naturally took a toll on his relationship with Kimberly, and the two would split sometime in 2011. But before the split, there was allegedly an evening in which Kimberly took the bottle away from Keyes and he threatened to you-know-what to himself because of it. And he later admitted to spending time with ladies of the night at some point during his travels, and even potentially in Alaska. Though he never confessed to specifically murdering a lady of the night, the FBI did have their suspicions considering his patterns. Yet even with these struggles, friends and neighbors would never have guessed that these were more than just hiccups in an otherwise well-adjusted individual. Bill and Lorraine Currier were a married couple in their 50s, living in Essex, Vermont. And Bill was an animal care technician known for his love and dedication to helping animals, as well as always offering a hand to neighbors. And Lorraine worked at Fletcher Allen Healthcare and was known and loved for her caring demeanor and patience. And they had lived a quiet and happy life together since their marriage in 1985. And they had no children of their own, but took special care of their pets. And they were the sort of people who loved their jobs and never missed work without notice. So Keyes targeted the Curriers at random on June 8, 2011, based on the fact that their house had an easy way to enter through the garage. And some sources also note he was looking for a place that had a couple living in it with no kids and no dogs. And he flew from Alaska to Chicago just a few days prior, rented a car, and then drove over 1,000 miles to Vermont in search of his next victims. He was the epitome of a patient serial killer. And this is the location I mentioned before that Keyes had buried one of his kits a couple years prior. So on the night of the 8th, Keyes went up to the house wearing a headlamp and carrying a gun. And he first cut their phone line and disabled their alarm system. And then he broke a window to get into the attached garage and made his way into the main house from there. And the couple was asleep in their bed. And he woke them up at gunpoint to subdue them with zip ties for their wrists. and they obeyed his demands despite their fear. And Keyes did allow them to get dressed and put their slippers on to help them get over the glass as he moves them to their 1996 Saturn. And then he drove them in their car to an abandoned farmhouse that he had chosen earlier as the murder spot. So grabbing Bill, he dragged him into the house and bound him downstairs. And as he did, Lorraine tried to escape, but he chased her down and brought her inside as well, but to a separate area. And Bill kept calling out, quote unquote, "Where's my wife?" After which Keyes shot him to death. And he then focused on Lorraine, and he would first SA her and then move on to strangling her, which would knock her unconscious at some point. And when she woke up again, she again fought for her life, which Keyes later noted that she was quote unquote feisty. But in the end, he strangled her to death. And after he committed the murders, Keyes placed their bodies in trash bags and hid them under debris. And he poured Drano on top of their bodies to try and decompose them quicker, and then drove the courier's car to an apartment complex, abandoned it, and returned to get his rental car. And he allegedly stole a handgun from the courier's residence, which he hid with his own weapon and remaining materials back into the cache and placed it in a reservoir in Parishville, New York. So the next day, when Bill and Lorraine both failed to show up to work, coworkers immediately knew something was wrong. And police went to their home and saw signs of home invasion, including the broken glass and cut phone line and missing car and personal gun. But both Lorraine's glasses and Bill's insulin were still in the house, which was odd. And a major search and investigation would begin, but no solid leads could be found at the time. And their abandoned car was found a few days later, but it offered very few clues. And the case would go cold, and it wasn't until Keyes' later confession that the truth would come to light. But their bodies would never be recovered. And the farmhouse that was the scene of the crime was demolished, and the debris was sent to a landfill before police ever knew it took place there. And a statement was released in honor of Bill and Lorraine's bravery that night, saying, quote, "They fought to the end," unquote. So Samantha Koenig was a barista from Anchorage, Alaska, born on August 30th, 1993. She was a smart and sociable young woman known for her warm smile and bubbly personality. And she had grown up in Anchorage and had dreams of joining the Navy to become a nurse. And she was dating a young man named Dwayne and living with her dad, James, who believed the world revolved around her. So Samantha worked the late shift at the small roadside coffee shop known as Common Grounds. And she did that to earn money that she put towards her dream as she figured out her next steps in life. And for whatever reason, Keyes decided to break his own rule on February 1st, 2012, and abduct Samantha on his own turf. So that evening, she was working the stand alone, and just before 8 p.m., after closing time, Keyes came up to the window wearing a ski mask and ordered a coffee. And as Samantha turned around to hand him the drink, Keyes pulled out a gun, and he told her it was a robbery and asked her to turn off the lights. And once she did, he climbed through the window and bound her hands. And then he led her across the street towards his white pickup truck, but she attempted to escape. And that's when Keyes would tackle her and threaten her with the gun to force her cooperation, which she gave and walked with him to the truck. All the while assuring her that this was for a ransom and that he wasn't going to hurt her in order to keep her calm. And he then realized that Samantha's cell phone was still back at the stand, so he went back to get it, and also took the cash from the register and locked up the stand. So with Samantha's cell in his hands, he sent a text to her boyfriend and her employer to give them the impression that she needed to get out of town for a few days in an attempt to stop them from looking for her. And Keyes then drove her to his property and brought her to a small shed behind the main house. And there, he would SA Samantha and strangle her to death. And he would reveal in his confession that he killed her just hours after the abduction, and then left her body there to go back into the house and be with Kimberly and Lainey as if nothing had happened, because at this point, they were still together. And a few hours later, Keyes and Lainey left for a cruise out of New Orleans. And they flew into Texas together and then drove to New Orleans for the cruise. So Samantha's family reported her missing when Dwayne found the coffee stand abandoned and received the suspicious text. And a massive search began for her along with the FBI investigation, but no one suspected Keyes even slightly. And surveillance footage had caught only a masked figure, and the text had misled people to believe it was someone she knew, or perhaps she did just leave on her own. And as the search for Samantha escalated, Keyes enjoyed himself on a leisurely trip like the piece of shit he is. And he returned from vacation on February 17th to find that the case was still a hot topic. So he decided to see if he could get a ransom out of her loved ones. And he took her body out of the shed, which was still there the entire time he was on vacation, with Kimberly still at the house, but it had been preserved from the cold, and he would put makeup on her face and sew her eyelids open to make her appear still living. And then he would prop her up, and he would grab a recent copy of the Anchorage Daily News and held it up next to her and took a picture. And the ransom note demanded $30,000 to be put into Samantha's bank account for her, quote-unquote, safe return. And Keyes texted Dwayne on February 24th about the location of the note. So desperate at the very thought that she could still be alive, the family raised the funds through community help and some savings and deposited the money. The exact amount seems to vary between sources, some claiming the full amount, others like a partial amount of $5,000 into her account. But right after the photo, Keyes would dismember her remains and sink them into the Matanuska Lake, hoping her body was never to be found. Or at least not until the water thawed in the spring. And with the ransom money now safely in her account, Keyes felt a surge of confidence, though perhaps misplaced. And he set off on another trip, and this time through the Southwest, using Sarah's debit card to withdraw the cash along the way. And the withdrawals were obviously caught on ATM cameras showing a disguised man. But one of them caught a glimpse of a Ford Focus, a rare mistake for Keyes. So police and the FBI would eventually recover Samantha's remains in early April, and hundreds of people would gather around for her celebration of life on the 22nd at West High School in Anchorage. And the murder itself deeply shook the city because the coffee stand was a regularly visited location, highlighting the severe flaws of the current public safety. And a memorial plaque was placed at the Matanuska Lake in Samantha's honor, dedicated to her and eventually to all the victims of Keyes. And she is remembered as a young woman full of life, cut too short by an absolute monster. But at this point, Israel Keyes was still a free man. Deborah Feldman was a 49-year-old woman from Hackensack, New Jersey, and she vanished under mysterious circumstances on April 8, 2009, after having last been seen at her home. And her case had long been unsolved, and she was considered a missing person. But after his capture, Keyes told the FBI that he murdered a woman on the East Coast and buried her body in upstate New York in 2009. And though he never explicitly said her name, as was common for him to leave victims unnamed, he gave enough clues that led the FBI investigators to become relatively confident that Deborah was the victim. And Keyes' statements, along with cell phone records and travel records, line up with her disappearance. And he was known to be retrieving a cache in that area at the time, and reportedly, when shown a picture of Deborah, he replied, quote, "I'm not ready to talk about that one," unquote. And Deborah's body has not yet been found, but the FBI officially considers her a likely victim, effectively making her Keyes' fourth confirmed victim. And searches have been conducted, and investigators still hope that her remains may be found by unsuspecting hikers or loggers someday. But the case remains open until then. But it's of note that Keyes seemed to be guarded when asked about specific unsolved cases, because it was clear that he didn't want to give away everything that he did, potentially leaving some of his murders forever missing the key to conclusively being tied to him. And one case in particular that seemed to draw attention regarding Keyes was the disappearance of 12-year-old Julie Harris from Colville, Washington on March 3rd, 1996. And she was a Special Olympics athlete who had 2 prosthetic feet that were found in a nearby river, and her remains were found in the woods in April of 1997. And the case was unsolved. And Keyes was allegedly living in the area at the time. At the very least, it was an area he grew up in. And when he was questioned about it, he never admitted to the murder, but he mentioned that he had heard about that. And investigators viewed his lack of willingness to say more as suspicious. and the case hasn't been linked to Keys necessarily, but he remains a possible suspect. And then there's Susan Lyle, who was a 19-year-old college student who disappeared on March 2nd, 1998 from the State University of New York at Albany campus after her shift at Babbage's computer store. And she allegedly took a bus back to campus, got off near her dorm where she was last seen, but she was never seen again. And she was reported missing the next day, but her credit card was used that afternoon to take out $20. And her boyfriend said that they were the only two that knew the PIN for the card, but his alibi checked out, though he was never truly ruled out as a suspect due to his later lack of cooperation with authorities. And Key's role in this comes from the coincidence that Suzanne's disappearance happened just before his enlistment into the army in April, but there are no direct links to him other than this circumstantial timing, and this case remains unsolved. And then there's Giovanna Tyler, who disappeared in March 2004 after last having been seen at her home. And the 29-year-old native Alaskan woman had a husband and 4 children, though the relationship with said husband was allegedly strained at the time. And he has been cooperative with authorities. And Key's relation to this disappearance is that Tyler was allegedly at the Nia Bay police station at the same time he was, just a month before her disappearance. So the chance overlap led investigators to ask Keys about it, and he neither confirmed nor denied being involved in that case. And the case is still unsolved, and he still remains a suspect. And then there was 52-year-old Randy Gorenberg, who was taken from a Boca Raton, Florida shopping center in broad daylight on March 23, 2007. And she was discovered shot to death later that day, and her death is the first in a series of 3 crimes committed by the Boca killer. And the second crime was the kidnapping of an unnamed woman and her toddler son from the same shopping center on August 7, 2007. And she was able to catch a glimpse of her killer, though he wore a mask, and described him as a tall man with long hair and athletic build, generally matching Key's appearance. But she was released from the situation unharmed. And then the third crime was the murder of 47-year-old Nancy Bochicchio and her 7-year-old daughter, Joey Bochicchio Hauser. And they were killed in the parking lot of a shopping center in their car on December 12, 2007. And there was no direct evidence tying Keys to these crimes, but the sketch provided by the victim that got away bears a striking resemblance to Keys, leading some to consider him as a suspect. And then a week after Keys murdered Samantha Koenig, a 58-year-old man named Jimmy Tidwell disappeared in Texas after his night shift as an electrician. And in one of the confirmed bank robberies that Keys committed, he allegedly wore a hard hat and hair that resembled Tidwell's hard hat and hair. And this led to the theory that Keys crossed paths with Tidwell, killed him, and took his hat and hair to use as a disguise. And again, no direct evidence ties Keys to the disappearance other than the familiar disguise, and he was in Texas around that time. And Tidwell's case is still unsolved. So the FBI believes that Keys ultimately murdered 11 people in total based on the evidence that they have, including interviews and travel records. And another bit of evidence is the drawing of 11 skulls Keys made with his own blood, along with a pentagram in his cell. And the FBI views each skull as representing one of his victims, using the fact that Keys claimed at one point that he had killed, quote-unquote, less than a dozen people. And they have publicly stated, quote, "We believe that 11 is the total number of victims," unquote. And some authorities believe that the number could be higher, citing that Keys did travel internationally and hinted that he may have killed outside of the country, but there is no concrete evidence of this. And Keys remained in control of that information he provided about certain crimes, intentionally withholding details for victims that could potentially be identified because he is an evil person. And this seemingly stemmed from his concern about protecting his mom and daughter from learning of his crimes and possible publicity they may receive. So as mentioned earlier, Samantha Koenig's disappearance set a massive search and investigation. And Keys' ransom note and the deposit of the ransom money into Samantha's account immediately flagged the account as a point of interest for the FBI to watch shortly after the deposit. And Samantha's debit card was used to withdraw $500, allegedly the daily limit for the account, in Anchorage. And the withdrawal activity then moved out of state, next in Willcox, Arizona on March 7th, and then onto New Mexico, and then into Texas on March 12th. But unbeknownst to Keyes, who was usually more careful than to involve himself with anything other than cash, every time he used an ATM with the card, the FBI was notified and informed local authorities to be on the lookout. And then came his biggest slip-up, which was the captured footage of his rental car, the Ford Focus that we were talking about before. Because he had still been careful to use a disguise at every ATM he visited, but somehow the camera angle of one ATM managed to record his rental car, which gave authorities a bit of information that massively helped narrow the search, and a bulletin was circulated amongst law enforcement in eastern Texas. So on March 13th, 2012, a Texas Highway Patrol corporal named Brian Henry saw a white Ford Focus matching the bulletin's description in Lufkin, Texas. And Corporal Henry, along with nearby Texas Ranger Stephen Rayburn, pulled the vehicle over in the parking lot of a Cotton Patch Cafe, and allegedly because the driver had been speeding. Interesting, the same way Ted Bundy got caught. The parallels. And that driver was none other than Keyes himself. And they noticed that Keyes acted calm but seemed on edge. And when they searched his vehicle, they discovered cash with bright dye and clothes matching the disguise from the ATM footage, and Samantha's cell phone, debit card, and driver's license. So Keyes was immediately arrested and taken into custody on fraud charges from the stolen debit card. And within days, he was extradited back to Alaska. So while in custody, Keyes was confronted with the mountain of evidence connecting him to Samantha's abduction. And reportedly, he had initially denied involvement with claiming her belongings were tossed into his car via open window. Okay, you moron.
You know you're under arrest. You know you're not free to leave. You know what you're under arrest for. Okay.
But in the face of this confrontation, he confessed to Samantha's murder on April 2nd, providing information that only the perpetrator would know. And in exchange for certain amenities like cigars and coffee, and he agreed to tell investigators where her remains were hidden, like we talked about before, where the FBI found them. It's because Israel told them in April. And if he didn't, I don't think that they ever would have found her remains. And as we know, they were recovered exactly where he described. And though horrific, this provided her family with some closure. And on April 18th, 2012, an Alaskan federal grand jury formally indicted Keyes for the kidnapping resulting in death of Samantha Koenig and for bank fraud from the use of her debit card. And because he crossed state lines in the commission of his crimes, it fell under federal jurisdiction, which meant the possibility of the death penalty. And had it solely been committed in Alaska, the state does not have a death penalty, eliminating it as an option. But at the time, the public was still wholly unaware of the true extent of Keyes' crimes, as authorities kept his confessions hidden for months as they tried to get as much information out of him as possible. So Keyes was interviewed for more than 40 hours by a team of FBI agents, police detectives, and federal prosecutors from April to December of 2012. And the sessions were recorded, and several have been released. And he attempted to negotiate a deal for himself from the very start, because before he would cooperate, he wanted assurances on a few key demands. One, that he would avoid trials, or at least avoid being tried multiple times in multiple jurisdictions. And two, that his daughter's identity would be kept out of the public and that family members would be spared distressing details. And he pushed for a swift death penalty, because he had no interest in living out his days in jail. So he just made sure that he always felt that he was in the driver's seat for these interviews. And Keyes' requests were listened to by the prosecuting team, but no firm promises were made, as sentencing is extremely complex and would be up to a judge and jury.
Because I may have some options as far as that goes. How to get you at least some information without...
Well, and that's what we tried to give you. We tried to give you that ability.
Yeah, that was our idea.
The plan was, you tell us, where in New York, so we can work with them and get their assurances, and then more you starting those processes. But we just need to move them forward a little bit. It doesn't.
No.
But they did at least agree to some smaller things in an effort to keep him talking. For example, they agreed not to immediately release certain details to help protect his family's privacy, and at times he allegedly grew impatient with the lack of his demands being met, but he never fully stopped talking until the end, because that's how these guys are. They're just like pathetic, narcissistic, psychopathic idiots. And the concern for his daughter and his mother is something that many are intrigued by, especially in light of his supposed rule that he would not harm children. And he repeatedly mentioned that he did not want his mother or daughter to hear or read about the gruesome aspects of his crime. Boo-hoo, motherfucker. Consequences for your actions. So this concern very well could have been genuine, but equally as likely could have simply been a ploy to maintain control and influence people's perception of him. Or maybe even a mix of both. But still, for someone displaying psychopathic tendencies, it's something of note. One of the very few glimpses of potential remorse that Keyes showed, though only geared towards his own family and not actual remorse for any of his actions against innocent human beings. And in the end, no formal deal was actually ever signed. And the death penalty was on the table, but the timeline wasn't fast enough for Keyes, which he expressed frustration towards in his final months. And the repeated small favors for information like coffee, candy, and cigars showed just how desperate authorities were to learn what he was hiding. But once he began talking, he finally revealed the many crimes and related information that we've talked about throughout this video, including initially confessing to killing at least 8 people, the Courier murders, the 4 victims in Washington, and 1 in New York, believed to be Deborah Feldman and Samantha Koenig. And he hinted to more, but the closest we got to a final number was the clue he had told FBI regarding less than a dozen. And he kept most names to himself, but he did at least provide the names of Bill and Lorraine Courier and gave specific non-public details confirming he was, in fact, the killer. And he discussed his methods, including caches in detail and the study of serial killers, including his appreciation of Bundy. And he admitted to the confirmed bank robberies and arson as well. And when asked about remorse, he demonstrated that he felt absolutely none for what he had done. No regret or empathy for his victim, only potentially the impact it might have on his family. And he confirmed the essay of the teenage girl in Oregon, which was his first violent crime. And he also confessed to stalking multiple targets that he ultimately did not follow through attacking, including one scenario in which he was about to kill a couple at sniper's range, but a police officer showed up and started talking to them like a guardian angel. And he resolved to kill the police officer as well until a second one arrived, at which point he backed off. But Keyes was incredibly calculated with his responses and the information he revealed in these interviews, almost toying with interrogators, and he regularly held back information and enjoyed the sense of power that it gave him. And at one point, he even laughed as they became frustrated with him, saying, quote, "This is entertainment for me," unquote. Asshole, I swear to God. And if he ever felt like his wishes weren't going to be honored in regards to information he gave, he quickly would shut down until he received assurances. So the back and forth certainly played with interviewers' emotions, and he truly enjoyed keeping them guessing, rarely providing enough information to actually act upon with any level of certainty. And even to the straightforward question of how many people he had killed, he bounced back and forth without ever giving a solid answer to stick with. So on May 23rd, 2012, Keyes attempted to escape during a routine courtroom appearance. Similar to Ted Bundy. This guy doesn't even have his own personality. He's just copying another guy. What a pathetic loser. Not that Ted Bundy isn't, he also is, but my gosh. But he would break free from his leg bindings and leapt over the courtroom railing, darting towards the exit. And he caught those in the courtroom off guard, but he wasn't quite quick enough and was brought down by authorities with a taser. And this led to even tighter security for him at future hearings. But this was likely just a foreshadowing of his future plan. Keyes had no intention of remaining in custody or serving his eventual sentence. So Keyes' trial was scheduled for March 2013, 1 year after his arrest. And while awaiting the trial, he was detained in a high-security cell at Anchorage Correctional Complex. Yet despite being under close watch, he was found dead in his cell on December 2nd, 2012 at the age of 34. And it's unclear how he managed it, but but Keyes somehow acquired razor blades, and you can put 2 and 2 what he did with those. And not only did he use those, but he would also tie together bed sheets, and you can imagine what he did with those. And guards failed to notice until it was too late, and Keyes was dead. So among the things found in Keyes' cell after his death was a 4-page note written with a combination of pencil and ink on a yellow pad, and it was located underneath his lifeless body, and it was illegible and bloodstained. And the note was sent to the FBI lab in Virginia for processing, but it was concluded that there was no hidden message or meaning in the note about victims. But the note did seem to be Keyes' ode to murder, and in it, he criticized American society and values, calling out their obsession with meaningless things like reality TV, vanity, and the mindless 9-to-5 grind just to end up in a retirement home someday. And he also seemed to celebrate his murders through poetry with lines like, quote, "Your wet lips were a promise of a secret unspoken, nervous laugh as it burst like a pulse of blood from your throat. There will be no more laughter here," unquote. Just furthering the sentiment he felt in life. There was no remorse shown in the note for his crimes as he passed into death. And also found in his cell were the 11 skull and 1 pentagram drawings found underneath his bed, drawn with his own blood. And each skull was almost childlike in form. And one of them had the words, "We are one," written beneath it. And as mentioned before, these skulls are what led investigators to believe that Keyes ultimately had 11 victims, 1 to match each skull. And the "we are one" could mean many things, but it possibly meant that now, with his death, he was able to join them and be unified. Or maybe that he viewed all of the victims as part of his legacy, and the drawings represent that. But obviously there's no way to know for certain that he's gone now, adding yet another mystery he left behind. And these skulls were not revealed until May of 2020, when the FBI released them in hopes that it may help identify more of his victims. But Keyes' death caught authorities by surprise, because he had been actively talking during interview sessions and seemed engaged when he was doing so in the weeks prior. And his cooperation certainly didn't scream that he would be dead very soon. And frustratingly, it left more questions unanswered than answered, and cut off authorities from essentially the only source that could give information regarding the crimes, as Keyes had done such a good job at concealing what he had done. And his death was a cruel outcome for the victims' families. And for the ones that were confirmed, they were denied justice in that Keyes took the easy way out, in that Keyes took that from them. And for those unconfirmed, perhaps they'll never truly know what becomes of their loved ones. And the way in which Keyes died leaves suspicion and raises suspicion as well, considering he was supposedly a highly watched inmate, and his death left so many involved in the case with a sense of unfinished business. And knowing that there are victims out there who now may never be identified to bring closure to their families is beyond frustrating. But as of today, investigators are still looking into the case and any of Keyes' potential victims. But as of right now, that is where the case stands today. So that is that for this video. I hope Israel Keyes is burning in a special place, a special, hot, horrible place in hell as we speak. And my heart goes out to every single family that was affected by this, and all of the victims and unidentified victims as well, because I feel like I know in my heart that there was so many more than what we know about. If you have any other cases you would like me to deep dive into, let me know down below. I always read the comments, and I will see your beautiful face in the next video. Okay, stay safe. Thank you. Bye. It was the kind of forest you'd drive past without a second thought. Just another stretch of trees nestled off a highway in the New South Wales countryside. Peaceful and still. But behind the stillness, something sinister was hiding. For years, carefree young travelers from around the world vanished without a trace along Australia's highways. Some were written off as runaways and others as accidents. But deep in the Belonglo State Forest, a horrifying truth waited to be unearthed. A predator had been hunting in plain sight, and the peaceful image of Australia as backpackers' paradise was about to shatter. This is not just the story of a killer. It's the story of how one man's darkness left a scar on an entire nation, and how justice nearly slipped through the cracks in the process. Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder. All things that I love to consume, and I know you do too, you sick, twisted, beautiful, intellectually minded freak! And today we are taking a trip across the pond, over a couple skips across the pond, over to Australia. Sorry if I absolutely butcher some of the naming here, some of the pronunciations, but I'm gonna do my very, very best. That was terrible. Gosh, bad. But we're talking about a horrifying individual. So without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go Mach 5 down the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through this windshield into this absolutely insane psychopathic killer together. Talk about some pretty heavy stuff on this channel. And to get some escape, I like to go outside and I like to just scroll online or connect with my family. But staying connected online doesn't necessarily mean that you're protected online. So let me tell you about something that has literally changed how I use the internet every single day. And that's with Surfshark. Thank you to Surfshark for sponsoring this video. Listen, I travel a lot for content creation and even for the movie that's coming out soon. House on Eden, shout out. And when I travel, I often use public Wi-Fi. But public Wi-Fi is basically handing your personal information to strangers on a silver platter. And that's why I've been using Surfshark VPN. And honestly, it's become as essential as my phone charger. And here's what blew my mind about Surfshark. One subscription works on unlimited devices, which is super handy. So my laptop, my phone, my smart TV, even my gaming console, all protected at the same time. And most VPN companies limit you to like 5 devices, but Surfshark said, nah, let's protect everything. And here's where it gets really good. Surfshark had just hit a huge milestone, and they're now the only VPN with coverage in 100 countries, and that's insane. So whether I'm trying to access my banking app while traveling, or just want to watch some Netflix shows that aren't available where I live, I'm covered literally anywhere in the world. And let's talk about streaming for a second, because Surfshark unlocks the 15 largest Netflix libraries, including US and Japan. So I've been binge watching shows that I couldn't even see existed before. Plus BBC iPlayer, Hulu, basically everything just works. And the security side is what really sold me, because we're talking military grade encryption, strict no logs policy, and they use RAM only servers, which means even if someone somehow got access to their servers, there's literally nothing stored there. It all just disappears the moment it's disconnected. So having that insurance just gives me peace of mind. And plus, they have 24/7 live customer support, so when I had a question at 2 a.m. while editing, someone was actually there to help. And right now, you can get 4 extra months completely free when you go to surfshark.com/KallMeKris. That's surfshark.com/KallMeKris, and you can use my code KallMeKris at checkout. Oh, and here's the best part. You have a 30-day money-back guarantee. So you can literally try it out risk-free for a whole month, and if you don't love it for whatever reason, you can get your money back. But honestly, once you experience the internet without restrictions and with actual privacy, you're not going back. So go check out Surfshark now at surfshark.com/KallMeKris and use code KallMeKris for those 4 extra months free. And your future self will thank you when you're traveling and your banking app actually works, or when you're binge watching shows that used to be blocked in your region. So thank you to Surfshark again, and let's get back to the video. Ivan Robert Marco Malat was born on December 27th, 1944, in the suburb of Guildford, New South Wales, Australia. And he was the 5th of 14 children born to Stephen Malat, a Croatian immigrant. 14's a lot. My goodness. God bless that woman. And that woman was Margaret Piddleston, who was an Australian native. And the Malat's family's home environment was marked by poverty and violence. So they lived in rural Western Sydney, often in run-down houses with dirt floors, and this large brood, if you will, struggled to make ends meet. And Ivan's father, a wharf laborer, was a strict disciplinarian and an alcoholic prone to violence and outbursts. And Boris Milat, Ivan's older brother, recalled their father striking their mother at least once a week during drunken rages, which is absolutely horrible. And their mother, while devoted, had a fierce temper as well, though, sometimes punishing the children very harshly. It's like a domino effect. The husband's doing it to the wife, and the wife's doing it to the kids. It's just terrible. And growing up, the Milat siblings were surrounded by weapons. Guns and knives were a normal part of childhood play, and target shooting in the backyard was just a common pastime. And with 10 boys in the family, chaos was constant, and local police became very well acquainted with the Milat household over the years. So from a young age, Ivan exhibited disturbing behavior that set him apart even in his tumultuous family. And relatives later described noticing psychopathic tendencies in Ivan as a boy, because he had a bit of a cruel streak, taking pleasure in harming animals with machetes, to be specific, which is enough for me. Because in one incident recounted within the family, Ivan allegedly took the machete and, I'm going to say this in the only way he made one dog into two, if that makes sense, which is, it makes me want to cry. Any violence is bad, animal is just, oh God, as a child, thinking that is okay or just taking pleasure in that is, I can't wrap my head around it, honestly. And by age 13, his behavior had become so unruly that he was sent to a residential school for troubled youths. Thank God. I think prison would have been better at this point, but he was only so old, so. And Boris Milat would later say that Ivan, quote, was going to kill somebody from the age of 10. Believing his brother had a murderous disposition practically, quote, built into him from childhood. Send this kid to a bunker underground, my lord. But despite attending Catholic school like his siblings, Ivan's education was overshadowed by his poor behavior. And instead of studying, Ivan spent his early teens breaking into houses and stealing. Just petty crime. One of the ingredients in the serial killer stew, harming animals and petty crime. So Ivan would drop out of formal schooling at around the age of 15 years old and spent his late childhood in the pursuit of criminal thrills, as you do. And this would mark the beginning of Ivan Milat's lifelong pattern of crime and violence. So by his mid-teens, Ivan Milat's stint of minor crime had evolved into a complete lifestyle. And by the age of 17 in the early 1960s, he was already very well acquainted with law enforcement and had actually been sentenced to 6 months in a juvenile detention center for burglary. But despite his charismatic demeanor, which he did have, allegedly, he showed little regard for authority or social bounds, and he allegedly engaged in affairs with at least 2 girlfriends of his own brothers during this period. Quite the ladies' man. And quite the piece of shit. But he had no remorse in betraying those closest to him. So it's just setting the stage for who this guy is about to become. And academically, there was no record of Milat achieving anything notable at all. And instead, his teenage years were just defined by escalating run-ins with the law. And friends and peers, if any remained, took a backseat to Ivan's true adolescent companions, which was cars, guns, and crime. Sounds like the title of a 10% Rotten Tomatoes action movie to me, but anyway. So Milat's early adulthood saw a steady stream of criminal offenses and growing boldness. And in 1964, at the age of 19, Milat was sentenced to 18 months in prison for breaking and entering. And barely a month after his release, he was caught driving a stolen car and was handed a 2-year sentence of hard labor. The guy's got a problem. Because completely undeterred by these stints behind bars, Milat continued to just do what he wanted. He had no care in the world for anybody else except for himself. And in September of 1967, at the age of 22, he was convicted of theft yet again and imprisoned for 3 more years. He just spent his entire young adulthood in and out of jail. And these early convictions for burglary, car theft, and other property crimes show a pattern of escalation, as we can see. and law enforcement in New South Wales were by now quite familiar with the Malat brothers. And Ivan, in particular, had become a regular offender, cycling in and out of custody throughout the late 1960s. But still, the severity of his crimes and the length of his sentences kept increasing, and it was just a foreboding sign of what was about to come. And Malat showed no desire to reform at all during his stints, because each time he returned to society, he would just slip back into his old habits. And during this period, Malat's legitimate work history and personal relationships were unstable at best, because any semblance of a normal career was frequently interrupted by his prison terms. You know, the consequences of your actions. But in the mid-1970s, he eventually secured a job as a truck driver for the New South Wales Roads and Traffic Authority. Truck drivers. I know there's good ones out there, but my God, is that a good job for a serial killer? And this would be a position he would drift in and out of for the next 2 decades. But in the 1960s and early 70s, steady employment was hardly Malat's priority, to say the least. And as for his personal life, Ivan demonstrated a strong disregard for conventional morality. He was known to charm women with his looks and confidence, but these relationships were often fleeting and very dysfunctional. And as noted before, he even seduced women within his brother's circle. But it would not be until the late 1980s that Malat entered into a serious marriage, and even that union would be overshadowed by violence. But we'll get to that shortly. So in his 20s, Malat's main commitments were to his own impulses and desires, rather than to any sort of family or any sort of other relationship. And by the end of the 1970s, he had established a double life. On one hand, he was an outwardly unremarkable blue-collar worker to acquaintances, and on the other, a hardened criminal with a growing potential for violence behind closed doors. So as the 1970s began, Ivan Malat's criminal conduct took a darker and more violent turn. And the first known instance of his brutality occurred on April 7th, 1971, when 26-year-old Malat picked up 2 18-year-old female hitchhikers near Liverpool on Sydney's outskirts. And at knife point, he abducted the young women, tied them up, and them. But luckily, the pair eventually managed a narrow escape by fleeing at a roadside service station cafe. And Malat was arrested later that day and charged with 1 count of and 2 counts of armed robbery, as well as an abduction charge. So this incident marked Malat's transition from property crimes to violence against people. And while out on bail awaiting trial in 1973, he and some of his brothers committed a string of robberies, just showing that Ivan was undeterred by the prospect of prison. And in a somewhat surprising move to avoid the looming trial, Malat actually faked his own life cancellation, if you know what I mean. And he would leave his shoes abandoned at The Gap, which was a notorious Sydney clifftop life ender spot, just to mislead police. And then he fled the country. And for about a year, he hid out in New Zealand under an assumed identity. And authorities suspected that upon sneaking back into Australia, Malat roamed between Queensland and Victoria, and possibly other parts of the country to evade detection. But he was eventually rearrested in 1974 when he resurfaced in Sydney after his mother suffered a heart attack. But in court, however, he escaped justice. And in 1974, he was acquitted of the charges after his defense lawyer, John Marsden, aggressively attacked the victim's credibility, which is absolutely disgusting. And he did so by exploiting prejudices by labeling them as lesbians. Which, like, for that to hold up in court at that time, like it wasn't that long ago, is absolutely insane to me. Definitely different times. But buoyed by this legal vindication, Malat just grew bolder, and Malat's inclination for extreme violence did not subside at all. In fact, it just escalated. And in 1977, he was implicated in another incident involving 2 female hitchhikers traveling from Liverpool to Canberra. And it was an attack in which he allegedly attempted to and murder the women. But he was never charged due to lack of evidence. It's like, it's weird. It's like, you'd think they'd look back at his record and be like, oh yeah, this guy's definitely capable of that. Like, I understand that you need evidence for stuff, but you think they'd dig a little more. I don't know. And though formal charges were absent, the pattern was clear. Malat was increasingly targeting vulnerable travelers and growing more confident in doing so. So he had effectively graduated from burglar to predator. And it's crazy because he would even speak very openly about violence. And acquaintances later recalled Malat bragging about how to incapacitate a person by stabbing them in the spine, and graphically describing how to turn someone into, quote, a head on a stick, which is very reminiscent of Ed Kemper, who literally said that quote verbatim, talking about women that he would look at and he would like picture a life with them, or he would picture their head on a stick. Just monsters walking the earth. But such comments, in hindsight, just eerily foreshadowed the grievous injuries inflicted on his eventual murder victims. So throughout the late 1970s and the 1980s, Malat remained an avid shooter and outdoorsman, often hunting in the very forest that would later become his killing grounds. So the 2 decades before his known killing spree saw Ivan Malat evolve into a hardened, volatile criminal who had proven capable of sexual violence, cunning evasion of law enforcement, and remorseless brutality. Just all the ingredients for a serial killer lying in wait. Just a giant steaming pot of shit serial killer stew, just of the worst kind. And behind the scenes of his escalating violence, Malat attempted to create a facade of normalcy in the late 1970s and late 1980s. And as mentioned before, after evading conviction in 1974, he secured a steady job as a truck driver with the Roads and Traffic Authority, operating out of Liverpool and traveling widely across New South Wales. And by outward appearances, he was a reliable road worker, known to his co-workers as quiet, if somewhat rough-edged. And in 1983, Ivan entered into a relationship with a teenage girl named Karen Duck, who was 16 years old and pregnant by one of Ivan's cousins when they met. What the is going on? This wasn't like 1910 or 20. Not that that would make it okay, but it's just like so recent where this is just, it's just disgusting to think about. Insane. So Ivan married 16-year-old Karen in 1984, perhaps seeking a conventional domestic life. So the couple would live in southwestern Sydney, and for a time, Malat's violent impulses were not publicly visible. But behind closed doors, the marriage was deeply, deeply troubled, which is not remotely surprising given who this piece of shit is. Because Karen would later describe Ivan as, quote, gun crazy, recounting how he found joy in shooting kangaroos during visits to the Belanglo State Forest, and how he kept a frightening arsenal of weapons. And she also endured his temper and physical abuse. And in 1987, after years of just terror, Karen fled the marriage in fear of her life. And they would divorce in October of 1989. And I believe that this was one of the kicking off points to him getting back into his murderous ways. Because despite marrying, Malat's treatment of women and family remained abhorrent, if anything. And in yet another breach of trust, Ivan carried on a secret affair with his own brother Boris's wife throughout the 1970s, so while he was married to Karen, which resulted in the birth of a daughter named Lenise. So through the 1980s, Malat continued living around the Sydney area, working intermittently, saving money to buy firearms and vehicles, and honing the outdoor skills that would soon facilitate his transition from violent criminal to serial murderer. And financially, Ivan was stable enough due to his roadwork income to fund his hobbies of guns and off-road vehicles. And by the end of the 1980s, Malat continued to be a seemingly ordinary laborer on the surface. But underneath, his rage and predatory intent were ready to burst. All he needed was the right opportunity and victims to unleash the full extent of his monstrosity. So Caroline Clark was 21 years old and from England, and Joanne Walters was 22 years old and was from Wales. And they were traveling in Australia when their paths crossed in the early 1992. And the two actually became friends while staying at a backpackers hostel in Sydney's King Cross district, and decided to team up for the next leg of their adventures. So on April 18th, 1992, they set off together from Sydney, intending to hitchhike south towards Victoria to find fruit picking work, or possibly travel west to see more of the country. So when weeks passed with no word from either woman, their panicked parents alerted authorities in the UK and Australia, and flyers were distributed and media outlets publicized their disappearance, and raising the fears that something had gone terribly, terribly wrong on the road. And tragically, those fears would be confirmed in late September of 1992. So on September 19th of that year, 2 orienteering runners in the Belanglo State Forest stumbled upon a concealed corpse in the bush. And the next morning, police investigators found a second body only 30 meters away. And dental records identified the remains as Joanne Walters and Caroline Clark. And the condition of the bodies revealed the horrifying violence that had endured. Walters had been stabbed repeatedly 21 times in the back and 14 times in the chest, according to forensic reports. And one thrust had actually severed her spinal cord, which was a wound that would have instantly paralyzed her. But Clark had been killed differently. She was shot in the head 10 times at close range, as if used for target practice. And she also showed evidence of stabbing to the chest and was found with a makeshift blindfold, suggesting the killer had sadistically terrorized her before death. And investigators noted other eerie details at the crime scene. One was a primitive stone fire pit that had been built nearby, and cigarette butts and .22 caliber shell casings littered all over the ground. And Walter's jeans were discovered with the zipper undone, but the top button still fastened, a sign that she may have been SA'd and then redressed in haste. And due to decomposition, it was impossible to conclusively determine if SA even occurred, but the implication was very clear and extremely horrifying, and my heart goes out to the victims' families and the victims. It's abhorrent what was done to these girls. These details painted a picture of a killer or killers who derived pleasure from cruelty and spent time with the bodies after death. And the discovery of Clark and Walters just sent shockwaves through Australia and abroad. And the British tabloids dubbed the unknown perpetrator the, quote, beast of the bush, and speculated that a serial killer was preying on young tourists. And Australian police, however, were initially cautious. And in late 1992, officials publicly downplayed the idea of a single serial murderer, suggesting it might be an isolated incident or the work of multiple assailants, despite the gruesome evidence. But still, an extensive search of the Belanglo State Forest was conducted after the first 2 bodies were found. But no further remains were located at the time, and without any immediate leads, the investigation into Clark and Walters' murders grew cold as 1992 turned into 1993. But unbeknownst to authorities, the killer had struck before and would strike again. The earliest known victims of Ivan Milat were not foreign tourists, but rather Australians on a road trip. 19-year-old Deborah Everest and 19-year-old James Gibson, a young couple from Frankston, Victoria. So in late December of 1989, James and Deborah left Melbourne to attend an alternative lifestyle festival. It was called Confest, near Albury, just over the New South Wales border. And they arrived in Sydney first, spent a couple of days sightseeing, then commenced hitchhiking southward on December 30th, 1989, hoping to reach the festival. Don't hitchhike. I say it all the time, and I'm saying it now. Don't hitchhike, my sweet little bean. So the two would attempt to hitchhike to get to this festival, but unfortunately, they would never make it. And when neither James nor Deborah contacted their families after New Year's, missing reports were filed. And early clues created confusion, because on December 31st, 1989, a hiker found James Gibson's damaged camera by the side of the road in Galston Gorge in Sydney's northern outskirts, which was far from any direct route to Albury. And a few months later, in March of 1990, Gibson's empty backpack was also recovered in that same area of Galston's Gorge. And these discoveries would just puzzle police, who at the time had no bodies and thus suspected James and Deborah might have met with foul play closer to Sydney, nowhere near Belanglo. But in reality, the items had likely been dumped by the killer to mislead investigators. Who do we know who loves to try to mislead police? We're getting there. But the young couple's fate remained a mystery for almost 4 more years. And on October 5th, 1993, after Clark and Walters had been found, a local man scavenging for firewood just stumbled on skeletal remains in a remote section of the Belanglo State Forest. And he notified police, and an intensive search quickly uncovered 2 bodies buried not far apart. And those bodies would be identified as James Gibson and Deborah Everest, the long-missing Victorian youths. And the injuries to the bodies bore the hallmarks of a killer's viciousness that would become all too familiar. James Gibson, for example, had been stabbed 8 times, and like Walters, one massive knife wound had sliced through his upper spine, paralyzing him completely. And other stab wounds to his back and chest would have punctured his heart and lungs, likely causing a quick but extremely agonizing death. And Gibson's body was found curled in a fetal position, suggesting the pain he'd endured in his final moments. And Deborah Everest's remains revealed a slightly different brutality, because she had been brutally beaten about the head and the face, and her skull was fractured in 2 places and her jaw was also broken. Injuries consistent with being struck with great force. And in addition, there were knife marks on her forehead and stab wounds to her back, indicating that even after beating her, the killer stabbed Deborah as she lay dying. But the discovery of Gibson and Everest nearly 4 years after they vanished would definitively link the 1989 missing persons case to the string of backpack murders. And initially, investigators were perplexed that Gibson's camera and pack had turned up so far from Belanglo, but now it was clear that something more sinister had taken place in the forest. And the murders of Deborah Everest and James Gibson also had a chilling effect on the Australian public, because the fact that such violence could be done upon locals, not just international tourists, I don't know why that would matter, but, it's just hitting home for these people, I guess, just underscored the universality of the danger. But meanwhile, detectives redoubled their efforts, realizing that a single madman was likely responsible for all of these killings, and had been active since at least 1989. So 21-year-old Simone Schmidl was an adventurous traveler from Germany, touring Australia alone. And in January of 1991, Simone planned to hitchhike from Sydney down to Melbourne, where she was supposed to meet her mother, who was flying in from Germany, for a camping holiday. So she departed Sydney on January 20th, 1991, with her backpack and an eager optimism familiar to many lone backpackers. But when Simone failed to show up at the Melbourne airport and made no further contact, it raised alarms among her family and her friends, and she would be officially reported missing. But with next to no clues and her journey spanning hundreds of kilometers of highway, the search for Simone did not yield answers for a very long time. And it wasn't until nearly 3 years later, with renewed police operations in Belanglo, that Simone's fate was finally discovered. So on November 1st of 1993, the New South Wales police were conducting a massive line search of the Belanglo State Forest. And that's where officers came upon a set of human bones in a clearing off a fire trail. And the remains were identified as those of Simone Schmidl. And like Walters, Simone had been killed with extreme brutality. She would suffer at least 8 stab wounds, including ones that would sever her spine and would have caused paralysis similar to the others, and others that punctured her heart and her lungs. So the manner of her death just showed an awful similarity to Walter's multiple stabbings, with control wounds to incapacitate. And disturbingly, at Simone's gravesite, police found clothing that did not belong to her. And those clothes were a pair of green silk shorts and a yellow top that were later identified as items worn by another missing backpacker, Anya Habshid. And this indicated that the killer had murdered multiple victims in the forest and perhaps moved or intermixed their belongings. And whether that was to confuse investigators or simply as a result of handling various trophies is unknown. But Simone Schmidl's discovery reinforced the growing realization that a serial killer was prowling the New South Wales bush. She had vanished over 2 years before, but now the link between her case and the others was completely undeniable. And the young German's solo journey in Australia had met a horrific end at the hands of a predator who showed absolutely no mercy. Gabor Neugebauer was 21 years old, and his girlfriend, Anya Habschied, was 20, and they were a German couple exploring Australia together. And in late 1991, they had big plans, because after Christmas in Sydney, they would travel across the country, aiming to reach Darwin in the Northern Territory, and then fly home to Germany a month later. So on December 26, 1991, which was Boxing Day, Gabor and Anya checked out of their Sydney hostel and set off hitchhiking, intending to head south and then west on a grand outback adventure. But unfortunately, they never made it to Darwin alive. And when the pair failed to contact their families or catch their scheduled flight home, they were reported missing. And like the other cases, with no immediate leads, their disappearance remained a mystery for some time. And it wasn't until November 4th, 1993, just days after Simone Schmidl's body was found, the intensive police search of Belangla Forest yielded 2 more grim discoveries. And in a bush-covered area not far from where Simone lay, searchers found 2 shallow graves about 50 meters apart. And within them were the remains of Gabor and Anya. And the condition of the German couple's bodies revealed both the killer's escalating depravity and the varying methods that he employed. Anya, for example, had had her head removed from her body completely, but her head, unfortunately, would never be recovered. So it appeared that the killer had taken Anya's skull potentially as a trophy, and Gabor had been shot 6 times in the head, execution style, similar to Caroline Clark. But there was no evidence of other abuse, and investigators determined that Gabor had been bound prior to being shot. So it's possible that Gabor may have been forced to watch or listen as Anya was murdered before he was finally executed. Just extremely just gut-wrenching to think about. This one is extremely rough. And ballistic evidence linked the scene to earlier murders, because the bullets that killed Gabor matched the caliber a Type 22 used on Caroline Clark. So the killer had clearly favored a firearm and brought it along on his deadly hunts. So the murders of Gabor and Anya just underscore the sadism of the backpack killer, because we can see during the murder and even after, he's escalating what he's doing, the viciousness in what he's doing. And by the time the German couple's remains were uncovered, the full scope of the backpack murders was apparent. In total, 5 women and 2 men, all young travelers, had been slain in similarly brutal fashion and hidden in the same forest. And the timeline of their disappearances ranged from late 1989 to 1992, but they were all discovered within a 14-month span in 1992 to 1993. So with each body found, the pressure just mounted on law enforcement to find who was responsible for these atrocities. And from the outset of the backpack murderer investigation, police and media speculated that Ivan Milat's murderous career may not have begun or ended with the 7 confirmed victims, because there were patterns and similarities in other disappearances that led authorities to revisit cold cases from the 1970s and the 1980s. And over the years, Milat had been publicly linked to a number of unsolved cases, though unfortunately none have been proven. But among the cases often discussed are 3 young women who vanished from the Newcastle area in 1978 to 1979. And those 3 women were Leanne Goodall, who was 20 years old, Robin Hickey, who was 18 years old, and Amanda Robinson, who was 14 years old. And all 3 went missing near highways within a few months of each other, in an area where Milat often worked as a road crew member at the time. And Milat was named as a person of interest in those cases, but insufficient evidence prevented further action, unfortunately. And similarly, in 2004 to 2006, Milat was formally investigated regarding the disappearance of 2 Sydney nurses, Gillian Jameson and Deborah Bulkin, both of which were 19 and 20 years old, and who were last seen at a tavern in June of 1980 speaking to a man in a cowboy hat. And Milat denied involvement when he was questioned, but he was mentioned as a person of interest at the wrongful death inquiry. And another likely victim often mentioned is Annette Briffa, who was 18 years old, and who had vanished while hitchhiking north of Sydney in January of 1980. And an inquest in 2005 heard that although there was no hard proof Ivan Milat killed her, he could not be eliminated from the investigation altogether. And the investigators have even looked back to cases as early as the 1960s, because Milat's brother, Boris, claimed in 2015 that Ivan privately confessed to the 1962 shooting of Sydney taxi driver Neville Knight, a crime that left Knight paralyzed and for which another man was wrongfully convicted, which is f***ed up. And police have noted the eerie parallel between Knight's injury, an injury that was caused to the spine, as we know that he did to quite a few of his victims, that caused paralysis. However, no charges were ever brought against Milat for that incident. So all told, as many as 20 unsolved deaths and disappearances have been theorized as potential Milat victims by various experts, authors, and police task force. And these include hitchhikers and backpackers who vanished along Australian highways in the 1970s and 80s, their profiles and the circumstances just echoing the known victims. So the New South Wales police response to the backpack murders evolved from skepticism to full mobilization as the scope of the crime spree became very, very apparent. And as mentioned before, after the first two bodies, Clark and Walters, were found in September of 1992, police were cautious about declaring that a serial killer was at work. But despite media speculation, authorities initially suggested it might be an isolated incident or work of multiple assailants, given differences in how the two women were killed. But still, a dedicated team of investigators began combing through missing persons files for any similar cases. And early on, they noted that several backpackers had vanished without a trace along the Hume Highway corridor in recent years, including an Australian couple, who was Everest and Gibson, and at least 3 Europeans, Schmidl, Neubauer, and Habschied, whom of which we already spoke about. However, at this point, with no bodies besides Clark and Walters, linking the cases was largely speculative. So the forensic evidence from Walters and Clark's crime scene, which was bullet casings of a .22 caliber, ropes, and fibers, was collected and analyzed, but without a suspect to compare against, it remained simply data in a growing archive. But one of the few leads was a criminal profile offered by forensic psychiatrist Dr. Rod Milton. And after examining details of the first two murders, Dr. Milton suggested that the killer was likely a local man in his mid-30s with a history of aggression, someone familiar with the forest terrain, and that the crimes were motivated by the pleasure of inflicting pain. However, Dr. Milton did not initially believe a, quote, classic serial killer was responsible, and even floated the idea that the murderer might even have an assistant. So this guidance, while not pinpointing a specific person necessarily, did reinforce certain truths, and that's that the perpetrator was extremely dangerous, as we know, and he was likely to strike again if not caught. So the breakthrough in police urgency came in October of 1993 when the second cluster of bodies was discovered, which was Everest, Gibson, Schmidl, and the Habschied and Neubauer. So realizing they were dealing with a serial killer who had been active for years, the NSW police ramped up their efforts dramatically. And on October 14th, 1993, they established Task Force AIR, which was a special homicide task force of over 20 detectives and analysts dedicated solely to the backpack murders. That is how you do an investigation. And veteran investigator Superintendent Clive Small was appointed to lead this very task force. But this team faced immense challenges, one of which was a flood of information from the public and other police units, and dozens of potential suspects or persons of interest, and intense media scrutiny. So the government posted a reward for $500,000 for information leading to the killer's capture, which was an unprecedented sum reflecting the urgency of figuring out who committed these murders. So investigators began the painstaking work of cross-referencing missing persons reports, scouring records of anyone with a history of violence in the area, and applying computer-assisted link analysis to find patterns in massive data. And another challenge was just the geography, because the Belanglo Forest is vast and remote, and initially police weren't sure if more bodies even remained hidden. And after the October to November 1993 finds, police conducted an exhaustive search of the entire forest with over 300 officers and volunteers, line by line over weeks, to ensure no victim was left undiscovered. And by the end of 1993, 7 bodies had been recovered, and Task Force Air was fully engaged in one of the largest manhunts in Australian history. And the crucial break in the case arrived thanks to an extremely brave survivor. Because on November 13th, 1993, just over a week after the victims were found, police received a phone call from Paul Onions, who was a 24-year-old Brit. Because Onions had seen reports about the backpack murders on the news and felt compelled to report an incident that had happened. An incident that had happened to him years earlier. So in January of 1990, Onions had been backpacking in Australia and hitchhiking south from Sydney toward the town of Mildura. And he was picked up on the Hume Highway near Casula by a man who introduced himself as, quote, Bill. And as Onions later recounted, at first, the ride was uneventful. But Bill began asking probing questions about his plans, and whether Onions had family or friends expecting him at his destination, and if he'd done any special forces training in the military. He was basically sizing the guy up to see if he could kill him. And Onions during this time would become increasingly concerned as the questions continued along with, quote, Bill making racist and xenophobic comments. And south of the town Mittagong, the driver pulled over under the pretense of searching for some cassettes. And that's when he would suddenly produce a handgun and a length of rope, announcing it was a robbery. And Paul Onions knew he was in mortal danger at this point. But he managed to fling open the door and run for his life. And the assailant fired a shot and gave chase, but Onions zigzagged down the highway until a passing car stopped for him. Thank God. And in a stroke of luck, a woman named Joanne Barry was driving by and picked up the frantic Onions. And together they sped off and later reported the incident to Bowral police, providing a description of the attacker, including his mustache and likeness of Australian cricketer Dennis Liley, and his vehicle and registration number. And at the time, in 1990, that report did not lead to an arrest, and the Bowral police would log the complaint, but with no immediate suspect, it just languished in a filing cabinet. And when Task Force Air detectives heard Onion's story in late 1993, it immediately rang alarm bells. Between the location of the attack, which was near Belanglo, and the MO, the modus operandi, which was a hitchhiker and a gun and a rope, and the time frame, which was January of 1990, which was smack between the known murders, were too coincidental to ignore. So digging through their records on April 13th of 1994, investigators unearthed the original Bowral police reports, and they would find Onion's report. And the details in that report provided a golden lead. And Barry, the Good Samaritan who helped Onions, was tracked down and corroborated his account, recalling the terror of that day. And furthermore, acquaintances of Malat, including a girlfriend of one of his co-workers, had come forward noting that Ivan was, quote, obsessed with weapons and that he talked about guns and hunting constantly. So the task force now had a suspect. And the name that kept coming up was, you guessed it, Ivan Malat. So in May of 1994, Paul Onions was flown back under conditions of secrecy to Australia at police request to help positively identify the suspect. And on May 5th, 1994, Onions viewed a videotape lineup of potential suspects. Some accounts say it was a live lineup, but we don't actually know for sure. But without any hesitation, he picked out Ivan Malat as, quote, Bill, the man who had tried to kill him 4 years prior. And this identification was the moment investigators had been hoping for, because it linked Malat directly to an attempted abduction and murder in the vicinity of the Belanglo murders. So along with other evidence they had quietly gathered, Task Force Air was now confident that they had their man. So they had a name, they had a face, and a living witness tying Malat to attempted murder/kidnapping in the area of the backpacker killings. So armed with a prime suspect, police moved swiftly yet carefully to ensure they could secure a conviction. So as we know, Malat had a very large family, some of whom might tip him off if they sensed he was under suspicion. Because although some of them didn't like him, a lot of them did. There was a lot of siblings to go around. So to prevent any sort of tip-off happening, investigators conducted covert surveillance on Ivan for several weeks before arresting him. So beginning on February 26, 1994, detectives kept watch on Malat's residence on Cinnabar Street in the Sydney suburb of Eaglevale. And they noted his routines and even discovered that he had recently sold his silver Nissan Patrol 4WD, the same type of vehicle described by Paul Onions, shortly after the first bodies were found in late 1992, trying to cover his tracks. Nice try, motherfucker. So this was obviously a suspicious move, suggesting Malat was trying to dispose of evidence. And they also confirmed through employment records that Malat had been off work on the dates of each of the known attacks. Suspicious. So everything was just lining up perfectly. And with Paul Onion's identification in hand, Task Force Air decided it was time to strike. So in the early morning of May 22nd, 1994, a coordinated raid was launched on the Malat family. And police teams simultaneously executed search warrants on properties belonging to Ivan's mother and 5 of his brothers, as well as Ivan's own home, to prevent any evidence from being hidden or transferred at any time or ahead of time. So over 50 officers took part in the operation, surrounding Ivan's house to ensure he couldn't shoot his way out or flee. And Ivan Malat was arrested at the scene, initially on charges related to the assault on Paul Onions, which was armed robbery and weapons offenses, so that police could hold him in custody at least. But what the search teams found was a damning trove of physical evidence, because inside Malat's home, they discovered a cache of weapons, including a .22 caliber Anschutz bolt-action rifle, parts of a disassembled .22 Ruger, and a semi-automatic rifle, which was the same model believed to have fired the bullets that killed Clark and Neubauer. They also found a Browning pistol and a large Bowie-style hunting knife. And ballistic testing would later show that the Anschutz rifle and the Ruger parts were capable of firing the unique ammunition found at the murder scenes. And even more incriminating were the personal belongings, because scattered throughout Ivan's house were camping gear and personal items proven to belong to the victims, including sleeping bags, clothing, and cameras that had been property of various murdered backpackers. For example, a distinctive water bottle carried by one of the German victims turned up in a bedroom closet, and Simone Schmidl's sleeping bag was found in Malat's possession. And at Malat's mother's house, police pried open a lock cupboard and found a long, curved cavalry sword, exactly the type of blade that could decapitate a person, raising the strong likelihood that it was the one that was used to remove Anya's head, which is horrifying, just absolutely horrifying. And additional stolen property from the victims, including clothing and camping equipment, was recovered at various Malat family residences, indicating that Ivan had shared or stashed items with relatives, and they just didn't question it or they didn't do anything. They just did nothing and let it go on. But many of the family members would allegedly claim that they had no idea that the items were linked to crime, but the sheer volume of evidence was overwhelming. So it seemed that Malat essentially kept trophies of his killings, and those trophies directly linked him to each murder scene. So with this evidence in hand, the case against Ivan Malat was solid. But still, with that rock-solid evidence, a long legal road lay ahead to ensure Malat would be accountable for his atrocities. And the public watched closely as the story shifted from manhunt to courtroom. So Ivan Malat's arrest on May 22nd, 1994 marked the dramatic climax of one of Australia's biggest manhunts, and the raid on his Eaglevale home unfolded at dawn, catching Malat by complete surprise. And officers reported that Ivan was initially stunned, but maintained an air of feigned innocence as he was handcuffed. And he was 49 years old at the time, and he was fit and a very muscular man who likely would have violently resisted had he had any warning, thus the overwhelming show of force by police. So in custody, Malat was cool and almost nonchalant, pretty much what you'd expect from a narcissistic, psychopathic sadist. And during the initial questioning, he denied any knowledge of the murders. And when confronted with the trove of victims' belongings found in his house, Ivan shrugged and offered implausible explanations. For example, he claimed he, quote, found some of the items along the roadside, or they were left behind by anonymous people. Nice try, you f***ing lying piece of shit. And luckily, these excuses obviously rang hollow, given the sheer amount of specificity of the evidence. And investigators later recounted that Malat seemed to believe he could talk his way out of it, but as item after item was cataloged, and each tied to a name and a grieving family, his answers grew faint. So on May 23rd, 1994, Malat appeared in court for a brief preliminary hearing, where he did not enter a plea and was formally remanded in custody on the initial charges. So within days of the raids on May 31st, 1994, he was formally charged with the 7 backpack murders, in addition to the charges for the Onions attack. So after a manhunt spanning years, the backpack murderer had been caught. And as news of Malat's arrest broke, a sense of just overwhelming relief swept through the public. And media outlets across Australia and internationally splashed Ivan Malat's face on front pages and led nightly news bulletins. And the photo showing a broad-shouldered, middle-aged man with a bushy mustache and a blank stare became instantly infamous. And almost immediately, comparisons were drawn to infamous serial killers overseas. And Malat was dubbed, quote, Australia's worst serial killer by many outlets. But he was most often referred to simply as the backpack murderer, a label that stuck for the rest of his life. And the revelation of Malat's identity and the details of the case provoked both relief and outrage in the Australian community. Because after so many months of fear since the first bodies were found, people could finally put a face and name to the evil that had haunted the national imagination. And public interest in every step of the legal process was intense, as it usually is with these kinds of cases. And when Malat was driven to court, crowds of onlookers and journalists just swarmed for a glimpse of him. And in the media, extensive profiles of Malat emerged of his work history, his family background, interviews with former classmates and neighbors, as everyone tried to understand how an unassuming road worker had become a sadistic killer. Little did they know he was doing this weird, insane shit since he was a child. And the media delved into his upbringing, reporting on the strict and violent Malat household and his prior run-ins with the law. And many Australians were just stunned to learn that Malat had been acquitted of a 1971 grape of hitchhikers, questioning how a violent predator was able to roam free all those years earlier. So the public reaction was overwhelmingly one of anger and just a thirst for justice, which is absolutely justified. I mean, he should not have been walking the streets or driving on the highways after all the other crimes that he had committed. It's just atrocious. Like, yes, during the investigation, this specific investigation, they really stepped up, but I mean, it could have been avoided. So family members of the victims, some of whom had traveled from the UK and Germany for the trial, were vocal about their hope that Malat would never see freedom again. Quote, "Whoever has done this, these are evil-minded people, and like dogs with rabies, they've got to be put down," said Ray Walters, Joanne Walters' father, upon learning of Malat's arrest, which absolutely agree. I can't even imagine the pain of going through knowing that your family member went through such a horrendous end. And his sentiment would capture the mood of many, because Malat was widely regarded as less than human, which, yeah, absolutely. He was regarded as a rabid animal that needed to be caged permanently. And the Australians' public faith in hitchhiking and carefree travel was deeply shaken, and many who had once encouraged people to explore the world now warned them sternly about stranger danger. And the tourism industry, for its part, had mixed responses. Some operators feared a downturn in backpacker arrivals, while others insisted that catching Malat made Australia safer than ever. emphasizing that such crimes were extremely rare. But in the immediate aftermath, there was a temporary dip in international backpacker tourism, but it seemed to have made a comeback with Malat placed securely behind bars, and the sensational headlines subsided. And the capture also ignited speculation about whether Ivan had acted alone or possibly had help from within his large family. Because given the difficulty of subduing 2 victims at once, early rumors swirled that maybe a brother or friend had been involved in some of the killings. And police did actively investigate some of Ivan's brothers, and during the initial raids, 2 of his siblings, Richard and Walter, were arrested on weapons and stolen property charges when illegal items were found at their homes. However, no evidence ever emerged that any other Malat took part in the murders. And by the time of the trial, prosecutors felt confident Ivan was the sole perpetrator. And one notable positive effect of the case was the heightened public vigilance. Because the idea that a serial killer could operate in Australia shocked communities into being more watchful. And people began reporting suspicious activities more readily. And in the global context, Malat's arrest and subsequent trial were followed closely in the UK, Germany, and other countries that had lost citizens. So internationally, there was an outpouring of sympathy for the victims' families and just a morbid interest in the case as it unfolded. Australia's image as a safe destination took a hit in the early 1990s, but the successful capture and prosecution of Malat somewhat mitigated that. And Australian authorities even pointed to the exhaustive investigation and eventual justice served as evidence of the country's effective law enforcement. So within Australia, the Malat case ultimately reinforced confidence in the police and legal system. And Task Force Air's relentless work and the role of the brave survivor Paul Onions are worthy of legend. So after Malat's arrest, the case proceeded through a meticulous legal process. And given the enormous publicity and public anger, the courts took care to uphold due process and Malat's right to a fair trial, which doesn't seem fair because what he did was absolutely not fair, but we live in a just society and we must do it that way. So Malat initially retained the services of John Marsden, who was the flashy lawyer who had gotten him off back in 1974. Just another piece of shit. But within weeks, Malat dismissed Marsden amid some dispute. And instead, he applied for a public legal aid and eventually a new defense team was appointed. Meanwhile, Malat was denied bail and remained in custody throughout. Yeah, thank God. I don't even understand why bail is a thing, especially for serial killers. Suspected serial killers. But luckily, no judge was going to release an accused serial killer on bail, especially given the risk of flight or harm. So throughout 1995, both prosecution and defense prepared intensely. And the prosecution team, led by senior Crown Prosecutor Mark Tedeschi, assembled a massive brief of evidence. And at this point, they had hundreds of exhibits, from the guns to the sleeping bags, and scores of witness statements. And a crucial part of pre-trial was the committal hearing that ran in late 1994. And it was effectively a mini-trial in front of a magistrate. So over 200 witnesses gave evidence at this committal. And this allowed the defense a preview of the prosecution's case. And the magistrate ruled there was more than sufficient evidence for Malat to stand trial of the 7 murders, plus the Onions-related charges. But one issue that arose pre-trial was severance. So Malat's defense tried to argue that 7 murder charges should be tried separately to avoid prejudicing a jury by sheer number of crimes. So they basically want 7 different trials because that looks better somehow, even though it's public knowledge. It doesn't make sense. Like, it makes sense for the defense, kind of, not really. It kind of just makes everything go longer and just costs the taxpayers more money and just hurts the victims' families so much more. So just scum of the earth, people. So luckily, the judge rejected this because the cases were clearly linked by MO, and it was efficient to have one big trial. So the attempted murder of Paul Onions was also allowed to be joined to the trial as well, since it directly tied to the pattern of crimes. And the defense strategy from the outset was to maintain Malat's innocence and claim he was framed or mistaken from someone else. Who? So by March 1995, everything was in place for the trial. Malat was formally arraigned, and he entered pleas of not guilty to charges as expected. So the stage was now set for one of the most anticipated trials in Australian criminal history. And Ivan Malat's trial commenced on March 26, 1996, in the Supreme Court of New South Wales, Sydney. The proceedings would stretch over months, filled with gruesome evidence and riveting testimony. And presiding the case was Justice David Hunt, who was a very seasoned judge. So the prosecution painstakingly laid out the evidence linking Malat to each murder. And the key elements presented to the jury included physical evidence from Malat's home. And jurors were shown the camping gear, clothing, and other items that belonged to the victims. For example, Simone Schmidl's sleeping bag and Deborah Everest's sleeping bag were exhibited, and both were recovered from Malat's house. And the Ruger rifle components and bullets were forensically matched to the crime scenes. So this forensic linkage was devastating for Malat's case, and experts testified that the odds of those ballistics marks coming from any gun other than Malat's were astronomical. And then there was Paul Onion's testimony, perhaps the most compelling witness that there was. So he would take the stand and recount in detail his encounter with Bill in 1990. And he pointed out Malat in court as that man. And then several Malat family members testified as well, some for the prosecution, and some effectively as defense witnesses. Really split this family up, this case did. So two of Ivan's brothers, Walter and Richard, were called, and they had been investigated themselves, especially Richard, whom the defense tried to cast suspicion on, but under oath, both denied any involvement and claimed to have alibis. So the prosecution used them to show that after Ivan's arrest, Walter and Richard had been found with weapons and items that Ivan gave them, which just demonstrated Ivan's consciousness of guilt through hiding evidence. And then there was expert testimony, which had forensic experts walk the jury through each crime scene, autopsy results, and significance of the similarities between each crime, between the spinal stabbings and the type of bullets, etc. And the defense strategy in all of this centered around just creating doubt. And Malat's lawyer contended that the evidence, while suggestive, was circumstantial. Which, how can you even practice law and present that? I don't understand that. How do you sleep at night? But he would say that there was no eyewitness to any murder saying, quote, "I saw Ivan do it." Yeah, because that's what you need in order for somebody to be convicted of murder. What? You know how not often that happens? Plus you have Paul Onions saying that he was gonna murder me? Like, I don't know. It's just insane to me. And they even floated alternate scenarios, one of which was perhaps one of Ivan's brothers, who also liked guns and had criminal records, was the real killer and had stashed items at Ivan's house just to frame him. So essentially, they tried to weave a story that Ivan was innocent and being set up, as Malat claimed, a conspiracy of police planting evidence or by a malicious family member. Just bullshit. Just a reach to the f***ing stars. And a dramatic moment came during the trial when Ivan Malat himself took the stand in June 18th of 1996. Because it's relatively rare for defendants in murder trials to testify, but Ivan was confident. I mean, we see this with like Ted Bundy and, countless other narcissistic serial killers. They're like, I can get out of this. But he calmly asserted his innocence, claiming, quote,
"My basic defense was that it wasn't me. I don't know who did it. It was up to them to prove my guilt, not for me to prove my innocence."
Just the fucking arrogance of this just shit stain of a person. Oh my God. So under cross-examination, his composure was tested, and his testimony, obviously, did not win him sympathy. If anything, observers felt he came across as cold and implausible, especially when faced with personal items of murdered young people. And through it all, Malat remained outwardly just confident and just unbothered. He truly seemed to believe he might be acquitted, like he was actually delusional. But as the trial wound down in July of 1996, the weight of the evidence was crushing. And after final arguments, Justice David Hunt gave instructions to the jury, carefully outlining how they could consider the evidence. And on July 27th, 1996, the jury returned their verdict after several days of deliberation, which, why is this taking several days, but whatever. But Ivan Milat was found guilty on all 7 counts of murder, as well as the charges related to the attack on Paul Onions. And the verdict was unanimous and came as a relief to the victims' families and to the public. And Milat reportedly showed little reaction. He actually smirked and shrugged, maintaining his indifference. But it was over now. The evidence had been overwhelming, and during the sentencing hearing, Justice Hunt did not mince words, and he sentenced Ivan Milat to 7 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole, 1 for each life that he took. And additionally, for Paul Onion's attempted murder, kidnapping, and robbery, Milat received 6 years each, totaling 18 more years on top of those 7 consecutive life sentences, to be served concurrently, which was mostly symbolic, as the life terms ensured he would never be free at any point. And in Australia, life without parole is relatively rare and reserved for the worst of the worst offenders. And Milat joined that infamous category that day. And Justice Hunt's remarks when delivering the sentence were powerful and captured the horror of Milat's crimes. And he addressed the courtroom, noting that, quote, "These 7 young persons were at the threshold of their lives, with everything to look forward to: travel, career, happiness, love, family, and even old age." And that Milat had callously snuffed that out. And he went on to say that the behavior exhibited was of such, quote, "callous indifference to suffering and complete disregard of humanity, it is almost beyond belief," which I could not have said it better myself. And he highlighted that the victims must have been, quote, "absolutely terrified," and that their deaths were likely neither swift nor merciful. And Justice Hunt also touched on the question of an accomplice, and he stated his opinion that it was, quote, "clear that in at least 2 of the killings, 2 people had been involved." I mean, for a judge to say that, it's quite telling, because, I mean, as you can imagine how many cases come across their table. So the thought of one of the brothers or somebody else being involved in this case and not convicted, it is quite terrifying. And this, of course, was not an official finding, but just an observation. But it just left that open possibility that Milat did not act entirely alone. But regardless, Hunt made it plain that even if that were so, Ivan was certainly one of those perpetrators and the primary culprit by all evidence, and thus ended the legal chapter of the backpacker murders. And the trial's outcome was hailed a triumph of justice, and it demonstrated the effectiveness of law enforcement and the courts in dealing with one of the most heinous serial murder cases the country and the world has ever seen. So Ivan Milat began serving his sentence in 1996 in Maitland Jail, a maximum security prison in New South Wales. And from the outset, he proved to be a difficult and notorious inmate. And in May of 1997, less than a year into his life term, prison authorities uncovered a daring escape plot engineered by Milat and a crew of inmates. And the plan involved collecting tools and attempting to cut through prison bars. But when it was foiled, Milat's would-be accomplice, George Savas, a convicted drug trafficker, was found hanged in his cell the next morning. And in response, officials transferred Milat to a maximum security wing at Goulburn Correctional Center, which was also known as Goulburn Supermax, in June of 1997, where Australia's most violent prisoners are held under highly restrictive conditions. And there, Milat was placed in a small, very small one-man cell under 23-hour lockdown initially, with intensive supervision. And for the next 2 decades, Milat's life behind bars was marked by defiance, self-harm, and zero remorse. And he never admitted his guilt in the backpacker murders, and in fact continued to file appeals and legal challenges in effort to overturn his convictions. But in July of 2001, the NSW Court of Criminal Appeal unanimously dismissed Milat's first appeal, affirming that there was no miscarriage of justice in his trial, which, yeah, duh. And Milat then petitioned the High Court of Australia for a special leave to appeal. But in November of 2004, the High Court refused to hear his case at all. So that just extinguished Malat's legal avenues. And Malat, just enraged at being out of options, turned to hunger strikes and self-mutilation to draw attention to himself. And in 2003, he swallowed metal staples and bit off razor blades, forcing a trip to the prison hospitals as authorities feared internal injuries. And in January of 2009, Malat used a plastic knife to saw off his little finger, intending to mail it to the High Court of Canberra as a protest for not getting an appeal. Sounds like a very macabre fucking toddler. So after cutting off his finger, he went on a 9-day hunger strike, consuming nothing but water until prison officials intervened. And he ended the protest only when he became so weak he accepted a sandwich from the guards. And it was allegedly rumored that Malat staged this particular stunt to also demand a PlayStation video game console in his cell. I have no words. A request, luckily, that was flatly denied. And these antics earned Malat little sympathy, obviously, and the New South Wales corrections minister at the time publicly scoffed that Malat could, quote, starve all he wants. Amen. And he wouldn't be getting any special treatment because of it. But nevertheless, Malat's self-harm episodes reinforced his manipulative personality, because even behind bars, he sought control through any means available, including trying to inflict guilt or inconvenience on the system by injuring himself. And on at least one occasion, Malat was attacked by other inmates as a form of prison justice, and Malat recovered from these minor injuries without much complaint. So even as Ivan Malat grew weak in prison, law enforcement did not forget the possibility that he had more victims. And throughout the late 1990s and 2000s, detectives from NSW and other states periodically visited Malat in prison, just trying to elicit more information about unsolved cases. But each time, Malat would casually deny any sort of involvement. And in 2001, an inquest was held into the disappearance of the 3 Newcastle area teenagers from 1978 to 1979, which was Goodall, Hickey, and Robinson. And Malat was brought from prison to testify, but he provided nothing useful, essentially just shrugging and saying he didn't know them. And a police officer who was present said that Malat seemed to enjoy the excursion from prison more than anything, and treated the inquest like a, quote, day trip. But similar efforts would follow. In 2003, Queensland police interviewing Malat about several unsolved hitchhiker murders in their state found him polite but unhelpful. And in 2005, NSW police attempted to question Malat about Annette Briffa and 2 missing British nurses, also from 1980, but Malat again gave no confession or insight. And one of the more intriguing developments came from within Malat's own family, actually. Because over the years, a few of Ivan's siblings broke ranks and suggested he might have been involved in other crimes. And his brother Boris, for instance, gave an interview in 2015 where he stated that Ivan had hinted at killing a taxi driver in 1962, like I mentioned previously. And that Ivan did other things that nobody will ever know about. And Boris even took a polygraph test, which a polygraph expert claimed indicated Boris was truthful in saying Ivan admitted that early shooting. So investigators found the taxi driver story plausible, but ultimately unprovable, because he can't use polygraph in trials, and it remained officially unsolved. But Boris's outspoken stance caused a rift in the Malat family, most of whom remained tight-lipped or defensive of Ivan. So Boris was ostracized by many relatives for airing family dirty laundry, but he felt it was important that any other potential victims not be forgotten. And another terrifying chapter in the Malat saga unfolded in November of 2010, when Ivan's great-nephew, Matthew Malat, murdered his friend in Belanglo State Forest, the very same forest where Ivan had killed before. And Matthew, who was only 17, used an axe to execute the crime and reportedly declared, quote, "You know who my family is." That's what the Malats do during this incident, which is so incredibly horrifying and chilling. It just makes you think of all the other things that could have happened within this family and all the victims. It's just insane. So in 2012, Matthew Malat was convicted and sentenced to 43 years in prison for that murder. And while this crime was Matthew's own, a completely separate atrocity, its location and method inevitably drew comparisons to his great uncle's. And police scrutinized any possible correspondence between Matthew and Ivan. However, there was no evidence Ivan instructed or encouraged Matthew to do so. So it seemed to be a case of familial influence or just mere coincidence, but I'm gonna say influence. But nonetheless, it reinforced the Malat family curse narrative in tabloid media, and it just pained the original victims' families to see the Malat name in headlines again for murder. And some of them wondered publicly if violence truly, quote, ran in the family, renewing debates about nature versus nurture and the lasting trauma of Ivan's crimes. But despite all these threads, as the years passed, it became clearly more victims than 7. And he was intent on taking those secrets with him to the grave. So police continued to revisit cold cases up until his dying days, but no new charges were ever laid. And the unsolved cases possibly linked to him remain officially open investigations. And many detectives involved have since retired, and some have speculated that given Malat's unwillingness to cooperate, we may never know the full extent of his crimes. Because in the late 2010s, Malat's physical condition began to decline, because decades of prison food, limited exercise, and likely the toll of stress took effect. And in early 2019, he started experiencing pain in his throat and rapid weight loss. And on May 13th, 2019, Ivan Malat, then 74 years old, was transferred to Goulburn's Supermax prison to Prince of Wales Hospital in Sydney for medical tests. And doctors discovered he had advanced esophageal and stomach cancer, an illness in which was deemed terminal. Boo-hoo. And realizing that Australia's most notorious inmate was dying, officials set strict protocols. And Malat was kept under heavy guard, shackled to a hospital bed, and allowed no visitors except immediate family. And even as his life waned, Malat maintained his stony demeanor, and he gave no deathbed confession and no apology. He came into this world a shit stain, and he left it a waste of oxygen shit stain. And by October 2019, Malat was moved to the secure hospital wing at Long Bay Correctional Centre in Sydney to live out his final days. And on the morning of October 27th, 2019, Ivan Malat died in custody from his cancers at age 74. And news of his death made headlines across Australia and internationally. And for many, it was final closure that the backpack murderer saga was over. And families of victims expressed bittersweet relief. And the NSW Corrections Minister Anthony Roberts voiced a more blunt reaction reflective of public statement, which was, quote, "He can rot in hell. He showed no remorse. The world is a better place without Ivan Malat." And that is it for the backpack murderer. My heart goes out to the families and the victims. At the end of the day, 7 innocent people were killed, most likely a lot more. And I'm very happy that this monster is rotting in hell. But if you want me to deep dive into any other case, let me know down below. I always read your comments, and I appreciate you guys being here very, very much. And remember, please, please stay safe out there, and I will see your beautiful face in the next one. Okay? Bye.
Crime, murder, disappearances, conspiracy, all things I love to consume. But that is what we are talking about today, my sweet, sweet, beautiful, sick children. Because if you clicked on this video, you are just as sick and messed up as me, and I love you for it. But you know what? You're just curious. You're curious, and I think you're smart. If you clicked on this video, we're smarter than everybody else, okay? And we're interested. We're interested in psychology and how people's minds work and how people are capable of doing these up things. We're just gonna dunk and shit on this piece of shit we're talking about today, which is Dean Corll. Corll! I'm sorry, I can't say Dean Corll without thinking about that. Anyway, today we are talking about Dean Corll, a serial killer that was active between 1970 and 1973 in Houston, Texas. But he was also known as the Candyman. Nope, not that Candyman. Nope, not that Candyman. This Candyman. Yes, we will be talking about this waste of oxygen today, but his story is very interesting because I actually didn't know about it, and I feel like I know everything about every serial killer because I do really love studying and watching true crime. And most people don't know about Dean Corll because he was overshadowed by another serial killer, which most of you will probably know as John Wayne Gacy, who was apprehended 4 years later in 1978 with a murder count of 33, whereas Dean Corll had only killed 29 boys, but most likely even more. And he also did that with the help of two accomplices, David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley, whom he was also murdered by in 1973. So let's get into the up tale of Dean Corll and the 29 murders he committed with his two accomplices. So let's go Mach 5 down the highway, unbuckle your seatbelts and slam on the brakes, because we're about to bust through this windshield and deep dive into this story. Let's get to it. Leave it in. So like I said, Dean Corll, otherwise known as the Candyman, was an American serial killer who was active between 1970 and 1973, who and murdered 29 boys in and around Houston with the help of two teenage accomplices, David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. But let's go back to the beginning, when this piece of shit was born. It was December 24th, 1939, Christmas Eve, the day before Jesus was allegedly born, and when Satan was, otherwise known as Dean Corll. It was in Fort Wayne, Indiana on a cold winter's night when Dean's mother Mary, no, not that mother Mary, gave birth to Dean Corll alongside his father, Arnold Edwin Corll. I love these names. Now, I want to preface that all the info that is available about Dean's upbringing has come from his mother and his mother alone, because Dean was not discovered as a murderer until he was murdered in 1973. And his mother was, let's just say, a tad bit biased. And by bias, I mean until her death, she thought that Dean was innocent, even though he was proven guilty. And she thought Dean walked on water, not unlike Jesus Christ. So I think we have to analyze his upbringing with a little bit of skepticism and assume she's leaving out some major details, but even then, his upbringing still is super fucked up and makes a lot of sense that he was who he became, if that makes sense. But either way, let's get into it. So Dean was known as a very solitary child. He didn't like to hang out with older kids and pretty much kept to himself at all times. Red flag number one. But Mary said that this stemmed from an incident when he went to a birthday party as a child where all the other children got a prize of some sort, but Dean didn't receive any. Boo fucking who. But this made Dean very upset and just kind of become a recluse and seclude himself from the other kids because he didn't want to get his feelings hurt. He didn't want to get his feelings hurt. Instead, he just wanted to hurt other children. It all makes sense now. So for all of you that don't like kids in this generation just getting handouts for doing nothing, the ones that don't will kill your children, turns out. I'm kidding. And from my research, I know that Mary was a narcissistic, coddling, helicopter type parent, and his father was verbally and physically abusive to Mary, and it wouldn't surprise me if he was also abusive to Dean Corll and his younger brother. There's no information that we have that says he was, and Mary said, no, he never touched the kids. I feel like he probably did, but we don't know that for sure. So this is just all the fucked up ingredients going into the serial killer pot of stew, okay? And it just gets worse from here. So early on in Dean's childhood, his parents moved to Houston, Texas, and got divorced twice, because sometimes once just isn't enough. And after their second divorce, Dean was sent to go live with his grandmother in Indiana for a summer where he worked on her farm. And this is where Mary said that he got, quote unquote, all the sexual education that a boy needed. What? So basically, at 10 years old, mind you, Dean he was just watching animals copulate on the property. So his whole sexual education was donkeys and pigs bumping uglies, consensually and most likely unconsensually. What could go wrong? But when Dean was 14, he and his mother and younger brother moved to Vidor, Texas. Now, Vidor was a fun little town that was known as a sundown town. Sounds nice, doesn't it? It's not. That refers to a town that has signs put up to warn African American people that they can't be caught in the town after nightfall. This wasn't that long ago. So this town was just littered with psychopaths, degenerates, and racists. It's basically a town just riddled with hate. A perfect breeding ground for a serial killer? And a reporter at the time, Sally Bigsby Defty, love that name, described the town as quote unquote, essentially the kind of place where the big event for the kids is to pour kerosene on a cat and light it on fire. I don't know, maybe try cow tipping like the rest of us small town farm folk and not use Mr. Whiskers as a romaine candle. I say romaine candle, Roman candle, romaine. Oh, that sounds fancy as Just some food for thought. So to be in a town where kids are just setting animals on fire as a pastime is just a recipe for disaster. For the loner, no gold star child, Dean Corll. And Dean, wouldn't you know it, fit right in. As a teenager, he would often target the local flying squirrel population by trapping them, torturing them, and then killing them, and then either putting them on a necklace to wear around town, or just shove them in his cowboy boots and take him to school. Red flag number 2 or 5, I don't know. I'm not gonna keep count. Red flag. But besides disemboweling squirrels, Dean had other pastimes, which included playing trombone in his school musical marching band. What a fucking loser. And candy. Because Vidor, Texas would become the birthplace of the Corll Candy Company. And this all stemmed from a local pecan salesman that came by Mary's house, Dean's mother, and noticed that Mary was making pecan pies. And he said to her, hey, you should probably make your pies on your own and sell them yourself. It could be very lucrative. And Mary thought, well, that's just a swell idea. So she packed up both the kids and moved on over to Houston and went to a candy factory where she would buy a praline recipe for a whole $50. And that's when the Corll Candy Company started. And Dean, always wanting to impress his mother, soon took over operations. He'd run the machines, he'd put the candy into boxes, and he would also deliver them. So this kid's life revolved around dead squirrels, trombone, and candy. If those aren't the final ingredients in the serial killer stew, I don't know what the fuck is. Just kidding. If you play trombone, it's fine. But if you're killing squirrels, get help. So after high school, Dean returned to his grandmother's farm in Indiana, you know, where he got his sexual education and got a job at a coil factory. And this is where Dean almost exclusively started hanging out with only children. Red flag number, we don't know. His regular playmates were a pair of sisters that lived down the road from him. And Dean used to make innocent 8mm videos with them, where he would make them recreate mock operations with chickens and their entrails that were in the replacement of real organs, because that would be bad. Not the dissecting chicken part of it with little girls. Now, all the adults in this situation are just like,
That's strange, but he's a nice kid, so it's fine. It's fine.
Like, everybody just brushed it off, which is just so concerning. But I guess in the times, people just didn't give a fuck about kids. I mean, people barely do now. I don't know. And it's also interesting because Dean actually had like a 0 crime record through his teens and into his early and mid-20s. And everyone would describe Dean as quote-unquote vanilla, which we will soon find out is the biggest misconception known to man, because this man was a shit mix of flavors, none of which involved vanilla. But at the age of 24, Dean was drafted into the army, where he served as a radio repairman in Fort Hood. And this is when a friend of Dean's in the army would say that this is the time where Dean would have his first homosexual relations with another man. I don't think you could have homosexual relations with another anything, but all right, thank you, Dean's friend. But that would happen very quickly because Dean only lasted in the army for less than a year because his mommy phoned up and said, "Hey, Dean, I need you to come back and help me with the candy at the candy factory, so you can't be serving time anymore." And they let him off with an exemption. So this guy's now a veteran of some sort. And when he went back to town, his mom had plopped the Corll Candy Company right across the street from the local elementary school. So I know that this is your demographic, Mary, but it's also your son's. So Dean, more than happy to be back, just went right into working at the Corll Candy Company. And he would be calling the kids over from the elementary school, handing out free candy that was spoiled. Sure. And making friends with the kids, otherwise known as grooming. And this is where this would all start to spiral into him grooming and making friends with kids and start to make relationships with them in order to take advantage of them in later years. Dean was a smart person. He knew what he was doing, and he played that long game, because as far as we know, he was not killing kids yet. He wanted to cover all of his bases and make sure that all the parents that gave a shit knew that he was just the innocent kid. Candy man, I couldn't do anything. I'm giving kids candy. But in reality, he was plotting. He was plotting. So Dean is working at this candy factory, having loads of kids come and get candy all the time. And he thought, hey, why not make a little hangout place? So he would put a pool table in the back of the factory where kids would come and use it and hang out with them. And this is also around the time where the people that worked at the factory, the adults that worked at the factory, noticed that, quote unquote, Dean wasn't all that interested in women, come to think of it, but he really liked hanging out with the little boys that came through. Red flag. Okay, let's not. Okay.
But they would also say, quote unquote,
but he was a nice guy and a hard worker, and he didn't seem to be doing anything too terrible. So,
what the f? So anyway, all the adults that worked within this candy factory just kind of pushed his weird behavior aside and shoved it under the rug and didn't address it at all. And after a couple years of the candy factory being established, it would be filled with young boys, either hanging out or actually working at the facility. Because child labor wasn't really a thing back then. But none of these boys actually reported any shenanigans or inappropriate behavior happening within the factory itself. Mostly, I think, because they were scared to say anything, or Dean had groomed them to the point of not feeling comfortable nagging on him, because he was like the cool place to hang out. And if they were to rag on him about something that he was doing inappropriately, they would lose that place. And in a town like Vidor, Texas, where there's nothing to do, I think Dean had built this kind of perfect scenario for himself. This was also around the time Mary, Dean's mother, went through her third and fourth divorce with her third and fourth husband. And it's crazy how a narcissistic, delusional, oblivious, money-crazed, child-neglecting woman can't keep a husband. It is just beyond me, I'll tell you what. But the stresses of Mary's divorces would lead to the Coral Candy Company going under. So Dean was forced to take a day job at the Houston Lighting Company. And Dean's mother moved to Colorado based on the advice of a psychic. So that fits the bill, to be honest. And this would end up being one of the catalysts that sparked Dean Coral's reign of terror. And he conveniently moved to a shed across the street from the Cooley Elementary School, the same school in which the Coral Candy Company was across the street from. How convenient. And he would pimp this place out. I tell you what. He installed a blacklight, a TV, a stereo, and a primitive alarm system that would flash a red light in his bedroom anytime anybody came close to the shed unannounced. So this guy essentially made every 1970s teenage boy dream party hangout dungeon. So he knew exactly what he was doing. And to be honest, if I was a kid, I probably would have checked this place out, because it sounds pretty dope. It's terrible to say, but it's true. I grew up in a little smart farm town, you know. This place sounds like the most lit place. But you can see how, like, he built this place to be a teenage hangout. Like, hey, come into my bedroom. There's red lights that flash, and it's super cool and kinky. I mean, cool. And you should probably come into my bedroom and then have your friends come over and we can see the lights flash. What the? Anyway, this guy was sick. We already know this. But a lot of teenage boys did visit this place, and a lot of which would just report saying it was a cool hangout. A lot of them would remember having pretty fond memories there. But some would recall Dean, quote unquote, getting a little too giddy around all the little boys that came in. But he was a nice guy all around. See this pattern that's happening? He gets a little too close to boys, but he's nice. So it's fine. Not fine. But as far as we know, the first couple years when Dean was living alone, he did not murder any kids, which we don't know for sure, but we'll talk about that later. But it was when he recruited his first accomplice, David Brooks. Now, David Brooks was from a broken home and had known Dean since he was 10 years old, back when Dean was giving out candy to all the children of the neighborhood. So he had worked on Dean for this now being 4 years, just grooming him and having a relationship with him before he started to take advantage of him. And Coral would start taking advantage of him when he was 14, giving him $5 to $10 for blowjobs. Brooks received and Dean giving. And according to Brooks, after being apprehended in 1973, he would say that Dean was the first man to ever accept him for who he was, because Brooks' father despised him in every way, shape, and form and would often abuse him as well. So Dean kind of filled that fatherly role, if you will, but would end up taking advantage of that and taking advantage of Brooks. But less than a year after Dean and David's first encounter, he would end up moving in with Coral and soon become one of the two accomplices of Dean. And it would all begin on December 1970 when David would end up walking in unannounced on Dean Coral, two young boys who were tied to Dean's infamous torture board. Now, this board was a 7 by 3 foot unpainted slab of wood with 4 holes drilled into each corner, handcuffs being at the top for wrists, and nylon rope being at the bottom for ankles to be bound. And the boys would be tortured and then eventually murdered either by strangulation or by a pistol shot to the head. Again, this guy is a piece of shit I hope is burning forever in hell. I don't know how many times I can mention that, but I hate him so much. So when Brooks walked in on Dean,
these two boys, he turned around and walked straight out, but would only be gone for a few days and inevitably come back because he really had nowhere else to go and he had no money. And then Dean's explanation for why the boys were there was just because they were part of a child pornography ring. No big deal. I just shipped him off to another state. You don't need to worry about it. And then David was like, yeah, all right. What? Not too long after, Dean would admit to David that he was and killing children and would offer him the opportunity, getting a whole $200 to recruit boys for him to take in and have Dean and kill. And for David, I mean, he was making no money at the time and he didn't really give a shit. So he said, yeah, sure. And the partnership and plan were cemented. So Brooks was not only dependent on Dean emotionally, which was very obvious, but now also financially. He would also buy Dean a 68 green Corvette for his 16th birthday to buy his loyalty. So this kid was just brainwashed to every extent. It doesn't make him good, but it's just a terrible situation all around. Not to mention the guilt of already witnessing Dean these kids and then not saying anything, and then other atrocities down the road. It's like he just kept digging himself a hole and he couldn't get out. So the first murders that we know David participated in were those of James Glass and Danny Yates. Now, Glass was already a friend of Brooks and had already been in Dean's shed multiple times, along with a lot of other of his victims down the road. So he was already comfortable around Dean. There wasn't any red flags for him. And Yates was just a friend of Glass's. So it was like a friend being like, hey, do you want to go over to this guy's house? I've known him for years and he's super cool. And this guy was like, yeah, sure. So it's like, not enough red flags for these kids, unfortunately. And to prepare for the disposal of these two boys, Dean had rented out a dirt floor storage facility just a few months before, and it was conveniently located less than a mile away from where Dean worked. So he would just end up dumping some of these bodies on his way to work. Some people get Starbucks, Dean dumps bodies. So 6 weeks after that double murder, Brooks and Coral lured another couple of kids, 15-year-old Donald Waldra and his 13-year-old brother, Jerry, to Dean's place, where David would look on as Dean strangled both of these boys to death. And a couple months after that, Brooks would convince another one of his 15-year-old friends, Randall Harvey, stop being friends with David Brooks, by the way, to let him and Dean give him a ride to work in his white windowless Acaline van. Red flag number infinity. What? There's just there's a flag, all right? I guess they didn't know about the white vans yet back then, but my God. Candy, white van, and creepy man. Anyway, now this van was one of Dean's torture chambers. Rings and hooks protruded from pegboards on the walls, and when the cops would search the van after Dean Coral was murdered in 1973, they would find binoculars, a two-way radio, and 15 feet of nylon rope. Now, after they secured Randall in the back of the van, they took him back to Dean's place, where Coral would rape, torture, and eventually shoot Randall in the head with a pistol. And that is when they would take Randall's body and bury it in that dirt floor facility out by Dean's work. I'm just wondering who works at this facility. Like, these guys are just coming in with a bag that maybe looks like a body and then coming out with a bag that doesn't look like a body, and they're all sweaty and dirty and it smells like a dead body. But I don't know. Nobody's getting a raise that works here. That's all I'm saying. Something should happen, but nothing does. So let's continue. But Brooks maintains to this day that he never actively participated in the actual murders of the boys. His only job was to capture and dispose, which is still fucking terrible, dude. Now, Dean was killing months before David came on board. His first victim that we know of was a University of Texas student by the name of Jeffrey Conan, who was picked up hitchhiking on September 25th, 1970. Don't hitchhike ever, okay? Don't hitchhike ever. But what's interesting is that when they discovered Jeffrey's body buried, it was covered in a layer of lime and his body was encased in plastic wrap. So it was under the assumption that this was not Dean's first murder. And some other evidence that suggests that is that Jeffrey was also found gagged with cloth in his mouth and both his hands and feet tied together while also being naked. So between the process, detail, disposal, and execution of this murder, it is pretty obvious that Dean was already a seasoned killer at this time. There's even speculation that Dean had multiple associates or assistants before David and Henley came along as well, and he would just kill them if they weren't good enough, basically. Now, after Randall, Coral and Brooks would commit another double murder, and all 6 of these boys lived within the same 2.5 square mile radius in the same neighborhood. So in this town and in these days, kids would just run away a lot. Like, it wasn't uncommon, and a lot of these parents just didn't really care, or they just assumed they ran away, or they were just difficult kids so they didn't care, or they just couldn't afford them. So it wasn't of the utmost importance that these parents find these kids. But that wasn't the case for all of the parents. I don't want to put any of the blame on the parents. But this did make Dean's job a lot easier working in this small space, because nowadays that just would not be a thing. But in these days, it made Dean's hobbies a lot easier. And also, the missing persons department in Houston didn't actually look for anyone. Their sole purpose was to inform families if they happened to come across them, or if they already were arrested or dead. So the missing persons department's lacking in that department, let me just say that. It was just basically, oh, you're missing? Well, hope he shows up. I don't know what to say about that, Stacy. Like, what the f? But victim 9 and 10 would not go unnoticed. David Hillegeist and his neighbor Gregory Winkle would go missing May 29th, 1971, and the Hillegeist family pulled out as many stops as possible as a poor family could back in those days. And after receiving absolutely zero help from the cops, they went to a PI that they would hire to investigate their son and neighbor's disappearance. And the only lead that the PI would find was that they might have been abducted by a guy named Chicken Joe in Dallas. But that trail ran cold really fast, and they really got nothing out of the PI. And the most f***ed up part is that the police found out that this family was hiring a PI, and they took this PI to court to make sure that his credentials were legitimate. So they spent thousands of dollars and weeks prosecuting this man and wouldn't spend a second or a penny looking for any of these kids. I know it's different times, but goddamn, you are fucking useless. And I can say that because none of them are working now, and probably most of them are dead. So chill. So the Hillegeist family, essentially out of all options after this, just plastered the cities with David Hillegeist's face. And the whole neighborhood pitched in, but none more than one of David Hillegeist's oldest friends, Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. And while Wayne would not know that Dean had killed his friend at the time, within 6 months of David's disappearance, Wayne would become Dean's second assistant and assist in another 18 more murders that would take place over the course of less than a year. So Wayne was actually originally supposed to be one of Coral's victims, fitting his victim profile to a T. But for Wayne Henley, early in life, he had a relatively rough one. His mother was very strict, and his father was an abusive drunk, which was honestly not that uncommon back in the day, but didn't give any excuses for what he did in later days. But his father left when Wayne was in junior high, and he also got into a lot of trouble with the law at a young age, doing breaking and entering, assault with a deadly weapon, and he was a hardcore teenage alcoholic. So these are just stirring that pot of trouble. You know what I mean? But what's a lot different about Wayne than David and Coral is that Wayne was known as a popular guy. Charismatic, people just loved him. Everybody described him as just an all-around cool guy, which would end up being the perfect accomplice attribute for Dean in later days. Because David was bringing in victims for Dean, but most people didn't really like David Brooks. People would describe him as kind of off-putting and quiet and shy, and overall just didn't want to be around him. That's an awful description of somebody, but I digress. So Dean Coral, seeing an opportunity, approached Wayne about joining his little up trio and recruit boys for cash. And it did not take Wayne long to start assisting Dean in these crimes of recruiting, torturing, murdering, and burying these boys. And Wayne would help murder these boys as well. And in 1973, when Wayne would speak to police, he kind of came up with a bunch of excuses as to why he would do this. But Wayne's first lure for Dean was 17-year-old Willard Branch. Wayne said that he and Coral picked up the boy and took him back to Dean's apartment with the promise of getting baked and drunk, which what teenage kid doesn't want to do that, you know? And after they did get high together, Dean would convince him to put on handcuffs, which is also something that John Wayne Gacy would end up doing as part of his MO as well. And after he put the handcuffs on, Dean would drag him into the bedroom, and Wayne would walk out of the apartment and let Dean do his thing, which he would and then murder the boy. But at this point, Wayne didn't actually know that Dean was killing the boys. Dean would actually give him the same excuses he gave to David Brooks, in that he was just the child sex ring. I still don't understand that excuse. But shortly after, Dean would find out what was happening and soon join in. Wayne's next lure would actually be his friend. Stop being friends with these people. Frank Agate. I don't know if I'm saying that right, and I'm sorry if I'm not. Same as Willard Branch, Wayne would convince him to come back to Dean's apartment. And Frank, trusting his friend, felt obliged. So he went. But would end up meeting the same demise as Willard, getting handcuffed and dragged back to Dean's room and then getting murdered just like he murdered all the other boys by strangulation and a pistol shot to the head. And although this shocked Dean the first time he witnessed it, he would say after he got caught that he still respected Dean after this. He said that Dean was a smart guy and he dressed really well and was smart-witted. And these two boys just looked up to Dean so much, I think as a father figure, that he just brainwashed the shit out of them, even after he was already killed. By the boys, too. So it's unfortunate. Now, around the time Wayne joined David and Coral's killer crew, Dean turned 30 and had a bit of a quarter-life crisis, because Dean was very self-absorbed and was very concerned about how he looked and how people perceived him. And he wanted to be younger. Shocking, because he wanted to hang out with younger boys. Shocking. So it was around this time that he literally only hung out with teenage boys and no adults at all, except for when he had to go to work at the lighting company in Houston. So Dean, Wayne, and Brooks would have parties for these teenage boys in Dean's apartments of varying degrees. If you were 12 to 14, the parties would be candy and sodas. But if you were 15 and up, it would be grass, pills, booze, and huff and glue and paint. So essentially a perfect trap for getting and murdered by Dean and his accomplices. So more and more kids are disappearing and more people are finally starting to notice after I don't even know how many at this point. I think we're around 12, but it was mostly just the friends of the boys that were noticing this at this time. And what Dean Corll would do to remedy this problem was to get the boys to write letters to their families before he killed them, which is something also Charles Ng and Leonard Lake, the serial killers, did as well, because this would keep the families not suspicious if they would receive letters saying that, hey, I got a job somewhere, or something else is happening, at least for a certain amount of time. One of the examples of the letter is, as said, quote unquote, I'm sorry I left like I did, but I got a better job on a truck loading and unloading from Houston to Washington. We should be back within 3 to 4 weeks. I'll either call you or see you then. Love, Johnny. And this would really help the law and families get off Dean's trail for the most part. And as far as Dean's murder methods went, some boys were strangled, like I said before, some were shot, and some got both. For example, one was shot in the chest and left to bleed to death in Dean's bathtub. Another got a bullet in the head from Wayne that entered his forehead and came out his ear. And the boy managed to survive this bullet wound and get out the words, Wayne, please don't. And that is when Wayne and Dean would both strangle him to death. Another boy was shot in the jaw and was just left to bleed to death in Dean's apartment for the entire day, meanwhile also being tortured by Dean, and then died eventually by strangulation from Dean. And the more Dean liked the boys, the longer he would keep them alive, which was worse in every way possible. Now, I'm going to get into some of the methods that Dean used to torture these boys, so I know I put a trigger warning up in the beginning, but here's another trigger warning. If any of this is going to be triggering for you or off-putting or anything like that, please skip ahead. So viewer discretion is advised. After Dean was caught, police would eventually search Dean's apartment, and they would find an 18-inch double-ended and a bunch of extremely thin glass rods that Dean would steal from the Houston Lighting Company. And Wayne said that Dean would shove these thin glass tubes into the boys' urethras and snap them off and leave them inside. He would also pull their pubic hairs with pliers or with his fingers or teeth, and most disturbingly, he chewed off the genitals of one boy in particular that made him very angry. Now, the victims' mouths were usually taped, but if they weren't, Dean would just crank up the music in his apartment to drown out the screams. And if you're wondering how so many boys were killed and shot in this short span of time without any of the neighbors knowing, it's because Dean moved so often, up to 5 to 7 times a year during a 3-year spree. So if a neighbor was to report him in any way, he would just leave immediately and evade suspicion. So by the summer of 1973, the trio David, Wayne, and Corll were starting to drift apart. David had gotten married to his girlfriend at the time and also got her pregnant. Oops. And soon after moved out of the Heights. And Wayne had attempted to enlist in the Navy, but was rejected because he dropped out of high school. Don't drop out of high school, kids. And Dean himself was planning on leaving Houston at the end of the summer in 1973. And we only know this information because, jump scare, Dean Corll's girlfriend of 5 years, Betty Hawkins, told us this. And looking back, Betty would have been the perfect beard for Dean, for both homosexuality reasons and for murders, because he would have a constant alibi for everything, because she was essentially whipped. She was a single mom, almost in her 30s, didn't have a job, so she would basically just do everything Dean told her to do, and they would not have any form of sexual relationship either, which... red flag. I mean, do you, but my God. And even after Dean's death in 1973, Betty would still not believe that Dean did any of these murders. So you can just see how brainwashed and whipped she was from Dean as well, which is unfortunate. So in the weeks leading up to Dean's murder, he decided he wanted to go back to where his mommy lives in Boulder, Colorado. And he would tell Betty that, "It's not a good time to come with me, Betty, okay? I gotta go by myself. You gotta stay back here with the kids, okay? I'm not going up there to elude the police or anything, or cause suspicion or anything, but I just gotta go up to Colorado, okay, see my mommy breastfeed a little bit, alright? And also, if David Brooks asks where I am, do not tell him where I am, okay? Not for any particular reason, not because I think he wants to kill me or anything, just cause." Now, after Wayne was caught, he mentioned that Dean may have started to become privy to the fact that Wayne and Brooks were trying to scheme against Dean and possibly kill him. He was feeling that the vibes were off, you know what I mean? And Wayne and Brooks actually did plan to kill Dean on several occasions, but to hype themselves up, they would huff paint like f***ing animals and then just pass out and then inevitably just get too tired and not kill him, which... why you do it once and then why do you do it twice and then again? But whatever. Anyway, but before Dean sensed that Wayne and Brooks wanted to turn on him and before he wanted to flee to Boulder, he would go to and reside in his father's old house in Pasadena, Texas. And this is the house that ended up being the most blood-soaked out of all Dean's places. And all of these murders would happen between June 1st and August 4th, 1973. Wayne and Dean would kill 8 boys, 5 of which were from the Heights. But, ironically, Dean's inevitable end would spark from one woman, a woman named Rhonda, who is none other than Wayne's girlfriend. On the night of August 4th, 1973, Wayne brought over 2 male friends and Rhonda to Dean's place to partay. And this is where Dean had an absolute fit, because Dean hates women. He only likes little boys, Wayne. God damn it, get it through your head. Otherwise, I'll put it through your head like I do to the boy. Sorry. But alas, Dean would calm down and he would grab the paper bags and the paint and he would hand them out to everybody and everybody would just start because that's what kids did back in the days. They huff paint. Don't have paint, kids, okay? But once everybody passed out, this gave Dean the opportunity to handcuff Wayne and bind him. Now, Wayne had a higher tolerance than the other people because he was always partying with Dean, so he would be huffing paint on the regular, all right? Just like me. Just kidding. Never huffed paint in my life. Only markers, all right? I'm kidding. So Wayne would inevitably wake up earlier than the other people and he would see what Dean was doing and be like, Dean, what the f***? And he would see that the floor was now covered in plastic and that both of his friends are tied up in the corner, one of which is naked and Rhonda, which is clothed. He really didn't like women. Tim Curley would be strapped to Dean's torture board and Rhonda would be tied up with a nylon rope on the floor. So Dean walked over and he turned up the radio and he got ready to do what he always did. Walking over to Wayne and saying, I'm gonna teach you a lesson, boy. But before Dean could do anything, Wayne started fast talking. He started talking his way out, saying, hey, don't you remember all the cool memories we made? Remember that kid that we killed and we went and grabbed root beer floats after? Wasn't that fun? I don't know what the f*** he said, but he talked his way out of it. And he also said that he would kill Rhonda for Dean just to make sure that he could get out of this situation. So Dean, being the sick that he is, said, all right, Wayne, that's cool. He uncuffed him, and then he stripped off all of his own clothing, Dean this is. So he was naked, and he would walk over to Rhonda, point at her, and said, get to work. And Wayne, in a rage, got up, picked up the pistol, and pointed it at Dean. And Dean ran full speed at him, saying, kill me! Well, why don't you just kill me then? That's the most terrifying thing I've ever thought about. A naked man just running full sprint saying, kill me, why don't you kill me? I mean, I'd kill you. And Wayne would do exactly exactly that. By the time he got 1 foot from him, Wayne would put 3 bullets into Dean's chest and 2 into his back. I mean, I personally would do a headshot, but that's just me. And police would arrive just a few minutes later because Wayne called them. And I love this because when the police walked in and discovered Dean Corll's body on the ground, they would describe it as quote unquote pale, puffy, and flaccid. And if that isn't a description for Dean Corll, I don't know what is. He's just a piece of shit. He's a piece of shit. And the police would find all of Dean's usual torture devices that we already mentioned, but also would discover a small wooden box with holes drilled into it. And they described it as a box that you can fit into, but if you were in there pretty uncomfortably. I don't know what kind of description that is, but obviously we know what this box was used for. And we'd also know that because multiple victims' hair was found in the box as well. And what's also interesting is that Wayne spoke to the cops and he probably could have gotten off really easily, especially given how the cops did not do any due diligence in checking in on anything. Wayne could have said, hey, yeah, this guy was coming at me. I used self-defense. He obviously tied up all my friends, and he would have been off clean. But Wayne was what we call an attention whore. And he literally just spewed off everything, giving them all the information about from start to finish of himself, David Brooks, and Dean. And David Brooks would get called back actually because of his father seeing this whole thing go on the news, and he wanted David to come in and tell them all the information he knew because he knew that David Brooks had been hanging out with Dean Corll for years, not knowing that David Brooks had actually assisted in killing all of these boys. So David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. would go to Texas penitentiaries, and they still sit there to this day. And Dean Corll would receive a veteran's funeral because he served a measly year in the army doing absolutely nothing but molesting people, most likely. But rest assured, hopefully he is burning in hell, and Satan himself is using an 18-inch sandpaper dildo on him. Sorry, but honestly. And the police would continue their streak of not really doing their due diligence when finding the bodies too. Wayne would tell them where the bodies would, and it was in this boat shed with the dirt floor of the facility that we had mentioned previously. And there would be 19 bodies in this shed, or that is what Wayne had claimed. But they would only dig up 17 bodies using prisoners from the local jail, using metal shovels and throwing away evidence that should have been put into evidence. The whole thing was done so sloppily. They wouldn't even dig up the last 2 bodies because it was too hot outside, and the shovels stopped working in the mud because of all the bodily fluids that were coming in with the mud. And all the bodies that were dug up were under a layer of lime and all wrapped in thick plastic sheeting, some of which even had the boys probably passing away within the sheeting because they were found with their mouths wide open as if trying to gasp for air. And among the bodies, they would also dig up almost perfectly preserved plastic wrapped bags of male genitalia as well. Now, there were still 9 bodies to be discovered, some of which would be found in a village called High Island, quite a ways from Houston. And Wayne would be the one to point them in the right direction. But one of the most messed up facts about this case is that the sheriff at the time ordered for the police to stop looking for bodies after they found the 26th body because they had broken the record of most people killed by 1 or more men in America. Basically, he didn't want to be the one in charge while 29 young innocent boys were murdered under his watch, or under his unwatchful eye. But as time went on, there would be a record-breaking 29 bodies found and murders committed by Dean Corll and David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley Jr., soon to be beat out by John Wayne Gacy a few short years after with 33 murders. So that is it for the up story and tale of Dean Corll. I hope you enjoyed this storytelling type video. I really enjoyed doing the research for this. It took a lot more time than my other videos, but I really enjoyed writing this and researching it and everything. So if you really like this video, let me know down in the comments below. Also, let me know down in the comments below who else you would want me to do a deep dive on, or what other conspiracies or other things you'd want me to do a deep dive on, and I'd be happy to do it. But for now, please like the video if you like the video, and also subscribe if you haven't subscribed. This is obviously Bestest YouTube channel ever, and I will see your beautiful face in the next video. All right? Bye.